Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad to be here with all of you. It's Saturday evening. We're here chilling out, and I'm going to spend my Saturday evening chatting with all of you. More of a relaxed stream tonight, but we'll see how it goes. Everything is unpredictable. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell, and away we go.
Of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Hey, everybody. So glad to be here with all of you. It's great Saturday evening. You know, today there was a conference call meeting I was on. I went to the gym and exercised. Today was a weights day at the gym. I go every other day. I do cardio one day and then weights the next day. So today was a weights day. Yeah, you know, just taking it easy, trying to just chill, not rush into things, right? We had a little bit of a break and just trying to stay on top of everything I need to stay on top of. But anyhow, folks, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. If you want to post this around, make this a bigger conversation, bring all your friends on board. That's always appreciated. The way we do this is that I generally give opening remarks. Those opening remarks are then followed by me doing the roll call. We find out who's on the other side of the camera, who's watching. It's always great to find out who it is, who's part of our little community here. And then after that, I answer super chat questions until the end of the night. So your super chats, lately people have been asking some really good questions. And just so you folks know, let me pull it up here. I am posting because I don't want to screw up the notifications. I do not want to screw up the notifications. When people ask good super chat questions, I have been posting them on this other YouTube channel that I'm making. It's called Caleb Maupin Videos. So let me just pull that right up for you. Go and subscribe to this other channel because I can't post on here. It'll screw up the notifications. I'm streaming every day, twice a day, most days. So if you want to go see like archives of what I've been talking about, go to the Caleb Maupin Videos channel. That's where you can watch a lot of my archived material, answer, questions that I've answered. Also, I do want folks to know that within the next 10 days, I will be doing a patrons only stream. So if you want to be on the Patreon, if you haven't signed up yet, or if you want to reactivate on the Patreon, now would be a great time to do that. Patrons only stream in the next 10 days. So there you go. Now tonight, for my opening remarks that I'll do, and then we do the roll call, and then I answer super chat questions for the rest of the night. Tonight, for my opening remarks, I thought it would be neat to kind of reminisce a little bit. Because, we use this slogan, out of the movement to the masses. We talk about out of the movement to the masses. In a way, that's a little bit of an outdated slogan because there used to be this thing called the movement. And it's not really around anymore. Right? I mean, there's Black Lives Matter stuff. There's people, leftists that are protesting against Donald Trump. But that's not the movement, right? That's something different. That's a completely manufactured thing, right? But there used to be this thing called the movement. Back before wokeism took over left-wing politics, back when there were still socialist and communist groups that had a lot of influence, back when, the boomers who protested the Vietnam War weren't all dead or weren't all, in senior citizen centers when they were still doing political stuff, there was this thing called the movement. And I remember the movement really, really well. And I got involved in the movement when I lived in Cleveland. And the movement was a pretty wild place. It was a pretty wild place, and a lot of funny things happened. The movement, you can call it the movement. It was remnants of the 1960s, 1968 through 1972. There was a big political crisis in the United States. All the college campuses were full of young people who didn't want to fight in the Vietnam War. And we're protesting. On top of that, you had this, the civil rights movement that had evolved into the Black Liberation Movement and the rise of the Black Panthers. And all right, writing it down. Keep the super chats rolling in, folks. That's the second half of the show. But writing it down. But there was this thing called the movement, and it was older people who had gotten involved in protests in the 1960s. And there were some younger people who'd gotten involved as well, but it was mainly older folks who'd been doing it for a long time. Brazil's older folks who'd been doing it for a long time, and there was just a crowd of them. And you would in Cleveland, where I lived, where I went to college, you would see the same people at every rally. There was a crowd of maybe 60, maybe 100, maybe even 200 people on a good day who went to anything that was left wing. And these people were the movement. And a lot of them, some of them were Vietnam veterans. Some of them were Quakers, members of the American Friends Service Committee. There was people that were communists. There was the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Workers' World Party, the Socialist Workers' Party. There was the Communist Party. And there was just this crowd of people that you called the movement. And every so often, Noam Chomsky came to town, and you knew everyone who was there. If Noam Chomsky came to speak at Case Western Reserve University, the auditorium would be full, and on the front row would be the same, 100, 200 people. We all knew each other, right? If Amy Goodman from Democracy Now!, she came to town to give a speech, why, the room would have the exact same 100 to 200 people in it. It was called the movement. It was this thing called the movement. And the movement was an interesting place to be. It was a remnant of times past. And I had some pretty wild experiences. And, I think about 2007. I'm going to tell you a story from 2007. 2007 was the first year I was in college. And the Bush administration had just lost the midterms. They lost the 2006 midterms. There were 2 more years left of Bush being president, setting the stage for Obama. The U.S. economy hadn't completely crashed yet, but the war in Iraq was going on, and it was very unpopular. And I was a freshman in college near Cleveland. And I will never forget the day that one day I was just in my dorm room. It was a Saturday night. I was in my dorm room, studying or on the computer fooling around or something like that. There was a knock on my door. And so I go and I answer the door. There's this young guy at the door, and he's at the door, and he says to me, "Do you have any drugs?" And I'm like, "Wait, what?" And he's like, "Do you have any drugs?" And I'm thinking, like, is he a cop or like what? And I said, "No, I don't have any drugs." He's like, "Man, I need some drugs. Do you know where I can get some drugs?" And I'm just like, "What?" And he's like, "Man, I just got out of the fucking army, man. I got to get myself some drugs. I got to get some drugs. I just got out of the fucking army." So I invited the guy in, sat him down. He was already a little bit drunk. And he had just gotten back from Iraq, and he was drunk, and he was wanting to get high, and he was a young guy, he had the army haircut, and he was sitting there in my dorm room, and for like an hour or so we just chatted. And then he proceeded to start going to other rooms and knocking on doors and, "Do you have any drugs? I guess that was a thing he just did, right? He just went to college campuses. We saw there was a college near where he was and just thought, oh, well, college kids have drugs, I guess. And so he just was walking up and down the halls of colleges, knocking on the doors. "You have any drugs? You have any drugs?" When he talked, it was pretty clear that, he didn't really want to talk about what he'd experienced as a soldier in Iraq. He didn't really want to talk about it with me. But it was clear that part of the reason that he was desperate to get some drugs was because he'd seen some shit. He didn't go into great detail about it, but he'd seen some shit. You know, and that's what people with severe PTSD will often do, right? I mean, it was like he was trying to self-medicate. It's kind of sad, right? But it was like, I remember that, you know, the knock on my door. You have any drugs? You have any drugs? Never forget that. But, you know, the movement in Cleveland. Remember when I went to an anti-war protest? I rode on a bus, and there were two older guys. These two older guys with big, long beards who were on the bus. You know, huge beards. There were two old guys who lived together, buddies, I guess, friends. They had huge, like scraggly beards, and they smelled awful. I mean, these guys didn't shower. They were just two really gross old men. And they were Vietnam veterans. And I remember I was riding the bus with them, you know, we're on the bus, you know, on our way to Washington, D.C. for a big anti-war protest, you know, and they two old guys, they smelled really, really bad. And, you know, they're scraggly. They got rotten teeth and big, long beards, you know, and, you know, I remember one of them said to me, he's like, how old are you? How old are you, young guy? And I said, I'm 18. He's like, I remember when I was 18, I was in Vietnam, you know, and that kind of struck me. I remember that kind of struck me, you know, like these guys, you know, I mean, here I'm on a bus going to Washington, D.C. or whatever. But, you know, when he was my age, he was, you know, in a jungle getting shot at, you know, I mean, it gives you a lot to think about. That was an interesting experience. But I remember in March of 2007, right? So the Democrats had just retaken Congress. They were getting ready. You know, it was 2 years until the presidential election. So I remember that the American Friends Service Committee, I don't know if people know about the American Friends Service Committee, right? That's the activist wing of the Quakers, right? The Quakers are this kind of pacifist-y, liberal religious group, right? They pray for the light within. You know, they don't have services like regular churches do. They sit in silence. You know, they call them Quaker meetings, or they get up and they say what the Spirit moves them to say. It's kind of a middle class New England old money religion. Quakers. You get a lot of college professors and lawyers that are into being Quakers, right? But the political wing of the Quakers, which is supposed to be like oriented toward pacifism, social justice activism, is something called the American Friends Service Committee. Right. And there was an office of the American Friends Service Committee in Cleveland, and they would organize peace vigils against the Iraq War. You know, they protested against the war in Iraq, and they would have veterans that spoke against the war. And so in the spring of 2007, I don't remember how long it was, but they decided, they got a permit, and they set up like a tent to have a 24/7 peace vigil in Cleveland, in downtown Cleveland. If you go to downtown Cleveland, there's this big mall called Tower City. And then across from the mall, there's this thing called the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. It's like a monument to soldiers and sailors who died. So they got a permit, the American Friends Service Committee. They got a permit, and they decided that they were going to have a 24/7, a 24-hour peace vigil to protest the war in Iraq. Right. And so all the movement people, the communists, the socialists, the anarchists, the elderly kind of pacifist folks, the folks who went to peace vigils on Saturday by the West Side Market in Cleveland, they all signed up to take a shift, to be there for 3 or 4 hours, to sit in this tent, basically, and with signs that said, bring the troops home from Iraq and the wars. And it was this like 24/7 peace vigil that went on for like a week. And I remember, you know, at the time I was part of the Workers' World Party. So we took a shift. There was a day where we sat there, and a lot of homeless people would kind of gather around the tent, and we had food there. Right. And so there were homeless people eating the food. Right. And so there were a lot of homeless people that were just kind of hanging out there. And there were veterans from the local Veterans for Peace group, that were just hanging out there. And I remember, sitting there in the middle of the afternoon, the day that we were manning the tent out in front of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, and just kind of sitting there in the middle of the day in Cleveland, as taking our shift in this 24/7 anti-war protest at the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. It was interesting, and people would come by and talk to us, and there were a lot of homeless people there who were hanging out to get the free food. And it was just kind of it was just kind of a thing we did. And I remember that. And one thing that I do remember was that, and this is important for people to know, is that, nowadays Black Lives Matter is really trendy, right? It's really trendy to talk about police brutality. It's really trendy to talk about racism and systemic racism. It wasn't back then. It wasn't back then. Not at all, right? And, one figure who I have deep admiration for, just deep admiration for, was a guy in Cleveland by the name of Art McCoy. And he was a movement guy, right? More of a black nationalist, really. But he was a movement guy. He lived on the east side of Cleveland. He was the owner of a barbershop, Superfly Barbershop. And he was a dedicated black revolutionary activist. He was dedicated to his people. He loved his people. He loved black people. He was angry about racism. And he had this group in Cleveland. I think they're still around. I don't know. I haven't been in Cleveland for years, called Black on Black Crime Incorporated. And it was a nonprofit that was dedicated to, bringing peace to the black community. However, Black on Black Crime Incorporated, his nonprofit, they also protested against police brutality. And police brutality was happening at the time, and mainstream media would not touch it with a 10-foot pole. Wouldn't touch it through a 10-foot pole, with a 10-foot pole, right? So we got. Okay. Good super chat questions. Very good. All right. And, this guy, Art McCoy, his group, Black on Black Crime Incorporated, they would have a meeting every Wednesday on the east side of Cleveland. And I had the privilege, really, of going to some of these meetings as a white person. And these meetings, there'd be like 80 people there every week. And they would talk about the need for there to be, more stoplights in the neighborhood because people were driving through and there were car accidents. They would talk about rent and the cost of rent. They would talk about all kinds of issues. And these meetings that they had every Wednesday, this is what like a real communist party in countries where the Communist Party is like a real influential group. That's the kind of meetings they would have. It was like a meeting of the whole community. It was East Cleveland, the east side of Cleveland, and then the city of East Cleveland. The black community would get together. There would be ministers there. There would be Muslim imams there. There would be local business owners there. And they would be talking about community issues. And it was definitely framed in a racial way, right? And it was definitely from the tradition of the civil rights movement. There were pictures of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. in their offices. And it was a group. And they were constantly going head to head with the Cleveland Police Department. And actually, I mean, it's really wild. This guy, Art McCoy, who was the business owner, he had been framed up and sent to prison. I can prove this. This story sounds too horrible to be true. So I actually looked it up before tonight's stream. I'm going to paste it in the chat here. This is the legal decision that happened. And you can read the details of the case for yourself. What happened was his nonprofit, Black on Black Crime Incorporated, they were getting contracted by the city of Cleveland to do some kind of community work. And so in order to put them in jail because of the fact that they were challenging the police department and sticking up for the black community, and they were this like center of community power, that was challenging the powers that be in the city and talking about the cost of rent and such. Because of that, the city framed them up. And they deposited like, $600,000 in their bank account accidentally. They deposited a huge amount of money in their bank account accidentally. And then when they spent the money, they charged them with fraud because it was an accidental transaction. Even though they had called up the bank and said, is this money really in our account? And they had checked and it really was. and it was transferred from the city of Cleveland because they then spent this money that was accidentally put in their bank account by the city of Cleveland. They put Art McCoy in prison for a couple years just for nothing. It was basically just, oh, the city's contracted, so we give them some extra money. Oh, they spend it. Oh, you fraudulently spent the money, and they threw him in jail. Right? That's the kind of thing that happens. That's how vicious the powers that be can be. So this Art McCoy guy, I mean, he'd been a black revolutionary activist since the 1970s. He was, he wasn't a communist. He was a black nationalist, but he was friendly with communist groups. He admired, the Black Panthers, but he also admired Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He admired Malcolm X, and he was a dedicated activist. And, and they had framed him up and put him in prison for a few years, but he was a hero in the black community in a lot of ways. And, he also spoke at the peace rallies because that was the kind of thing, like coming out of the 60s, the movement, you could call it the movement, right? It was people who'd marched for civil rights and people who'd protested the Vietnam War. They were just this block of people that you could call the movement, right? And the communist groups were part of the movement. And, young anarchist groups would come around and, but it was mainly old, boomers that made up the movement. And so I remember that one of the things that they did was that they did this peace encampment in downtown Cleveland where homeless people could come and get food. And then the last night of it, they had a big rally. And there was about, it was a couple hundred people turned up for this big rally in downtown Cleveland. And I'll never forget that there was a homeless guy who'd been kind of hanging out at the encampment who got up and gave a very touching speech. He'd said, before you guys had your encampment, I was homeless. I was thinking about joining the army. But then I was here at the encampment and I was eating your free food. And I talked to the veterans, some of the Vietnam veterans who were here, and they told me what it's really like to be in the army. So I've decided I'm not going to join the army. And everyone applauded. Hooray, hooray. It was really, really touching. And it was this sweet story from this homeless guy who had been desperate and he'd been eating the free food and decided not to join the army. And then everyone applauded for that. It was just kind of, you think about the movement. There was an element of it was very pacifist. It was very touchy-feely and liberal. It wasn't super radical. It wasn't like, these were not people who wanted to overthrow the government. These were not people who, who were going to march and storm the Capitol or something. It was just it was a lot of older folks who had seen the horrors of the Vietnam War. They were outraged by the history of racism. And it's like what you can call the movement. The message was kind of, can't we all just be nice, right? Can't we be nice and stop having wars? Can't we be nice and stop having racism? Can't we be nice and give people free health care and jobs? That was kind of the atmosphere of the movement, right? It was this kind of, group of nice people who were kind of burned by the evils of the world, burned by racism, burned by the Vietnam War, and wanted everyone to get along, and they were sweet people, right? And they meant well, but they weren't going to make a revolution, right? I mean, they were very isolated from the broad masses. And like I said, Noam Chomsky came to town, same people would fill up the chairs. Amy Goodman came to town, the same people filled up the chairs. Howard Zinn came to town, the same people filled up the chairs. Some of the communist groups would be selling their newspapers and there'd be people leafleting about various things. And it was this group of people that you saw at peace rallies, right? The Hare Krishnas. There were a few of the members of the Hare Krishna, the Hindu religious sect, right? They would come to things. There'd be 4 or 5 of them. And they'd have their shaved heads and they would, be drumming. And, I remember we had a Workers' World Party meeting one time. And one of these Hare Krishna guys came to it. And, it was held in an event. And it was dark after the event was over. So one of these Hare Krishna guys that had shaved his head, he pulled out he had this elastic band with a flashlight on the front of it. So he pulled it out and he put it on his head and he turned the light on. It was like a flashlight on his forehead. And so, it was dark outside. And so, it's time to go outside. And he pulled out the elastic band and he put it over his head and he clicked the light on and he walked. It was kind of like a miner has the light on their hat. Well, he had just this elastic band with a light on it. And it was on his head. And my friend, I remember looked over and he said, that man has got lights on his head. You know, it was pretty funny to see. But, you know, it was like a place for like quirky people, right? Quirky people who didn't quite fit in with the system, people who were at odds with the rest of society. You know, that was what you can call the movement. And when I say out of the movement to the masses, I mean, ultimately, it's realization that that kind of new left, people left over from the 1960s, that's not going to make a revolution. But I will never forget, I didn't tell you the best part. This is the best part. When I told you that we had this 24/7 encampment in downtown Cleveland, you know, this 24/7 around the clock. You know, I didn't make this up, folks. I've got news story to prove this. A UFO flew over the 24/7 encampment. Yes, this really happened. Yes, it happened. A UFO flew over the 24/7 peace encampment. It was dark night one night, and they were having their little peace encampment in downtown Cleveland, and a UFO flew over it. And CBS News even did a story about this. I was in Cleveland. I was participating in this peace vigil when this happened. Watch this.
Watch this amateur video closely, and you'll see a mysterious white light flying above Key Tower.
What the hell is it?
Sam Phillips recorded this video in the early morning hours of Saturday, March 10th.
It was making maneuvers. It was going really weird. It was just shooting out and come back and going towards the light. And I never seen it like it.
A similar sighting was made the following night, but this is the only known video of the unidentified object in the air.
I wasn't afraid, but I felt like something zapped my energy because I slept 3 days after that.
No lights flying above Key Bank Tower tonight, but Phillips says what he saw that he captured on DVD may have appeared because there was a peace rally going on down below.
I believe it was UFOs that came to the peace vigil because peace is a universal thing. And we are in dire straits on this planet. And we need any little bit of help that we can get, you know, from this planet or beyond.
Phillips says he's contacted police, hoping someone will be able to explain what he and close to a dozen others saw.
I want an explanation. I want to know, what is lights doing on top of a building in the age of terror?
So far, no answers, only questions and intrigue about what may still be out there up above. In Cleveland, Denise Strelzik, 19 Action News.
So yes, so not only were there Hare Krishnas there with lights on their head, and not only were there different old peace activists, but yes, our 24/7 encampment in Cleveland, our peace vigil in downtown Cleveland, was apparently visited by a UFO. I will never forget that. And by the way, the guy who filmed the UFO, his name was Sam Phillips, and I think he's still around. He had a show on local access television in Cleveland, and he would do kind of quirky, anti-war, anti-Bush, you know, anti-conservative, pro-marijuana oriented like television for his local access television show. And he's the one who spotted this UFO flying over the anti-war peace encampment that happened. You know, you have to wonder what it was. Maybe, you know, they were testing drones. You know, maybe it was that. Maybe they were testing, it was some kind of military experiment. They were testing drones. But yeah, that's a real news item, folks. CBS News covered the fact that our little peace vigil had a UFO fly over it. It was really, really something special. Here, you know, I mean, I could just, you know, I mean, it was wild. I mean, it was pretty wild that happened. Those were the movement days, you know, and the movement, it was something special. You know, you think about what these people went through. And, you know, it was pretty wild. I mean, years later, I remember I spoke at a forum in New York City. It was actually at the ballroom, the site where Malcolm X was killed. And it was a fundraiser for the MOVE organization. I'm actually going to pull up the flyer for it because, you know, it's worth pointing out. But, you know, it was like a fundraiser for the MOVE organization. You know, it was an event for political prisoners, basically. It was a political prisoners benefit event that I spoke at. I was invited to be a speaker at it, and it was for the Move 9, but there were also speakers there supporting Jamil Alameen, There were speakers there supporting Leonard Peltier. There were speakers there supporting a lot of different political prisoners. You know, I remember looking out in that audience that night, you know, and I realized like I was looking at a group of like, it was almost like I was looking at a group of war veterans, right? These were all people who had, you know, had protested for civil rights, had been in the Black liberation movement, and they were there to support like their friends who were still locked up. You know what I'm saying? And, you know, we don't, you know, I mean, I told you about those scraggly guys with beards that told me about, oh, you know, when I was your age, I was in Vietnam. Well, the Vietnam War, I mean, the movement might have been old and touchy-feely and can't we all be nice? But, you know, the Vietnam War was not touchy-feely and old and we can all be nice. I mean, it was a really ugly thing. And, you know, people were protesting because, I mean, a lot of young people didn't want to go die in Vietnam. You know, I mean, it was a situation where it was like, you know, their life was on the line. And the Black liberation movement, I mean, people were being lynched, people were being killed. You know, I mean, it was not a joke. It was necessity. I mean, people were organizing because it was a, you know, a kill or be killed kind of situation. And, you know, in such a situation, you know, I mean, people have to fight, they have to organize. And when activism becomes a necessity, it's a lot different than when it becomes a kind of personal indulgence. When you're just trying to prove to everyone on Twitter how woke you are, right? I'm so good. I am so moral. Look at me. I am against racism. Look at me. I am against fascism. I'm against, you know, sexism. Look at me. Look at me. It's this silly performative stuff. But, you know, you talk to the older boomers. Back then, it was a necessity. People's lives were on the line. People were dying, right? Bodies were coming, you know, every day. People were coming back from Vietnam in body bags. You know, the civil rights movement, Malcolm X was assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. People were being killed. It was a very different kind of situation. And when activism is a necessity, it's very different than when it's just kind of a liberal indulgence. But this is the flyer. I remember I spoke at this event. Very proud to have spoken at this event, right? A political prisoners fundraiser, right? And there were supporters of the MOVE organization there, and supporters of Jamil Al-Amin, and supporters of Leonard Peltier, and supporters of all kinds of Black liberation fighters. And I spoke on this panel. It was in 2016. It was an amazing experience. And I looked out on that audience. I was there in Harlem, you know, and it was a crowd of older African-American folks, you know, with walkers and in wheelchairs. And it was a crowd of people these were survivors of a war. That's what it was. I mean, these were survivors of a war. This was a room full of war veterans, you know, who were there to support their friends who were still inside. Who were there to support their brothers who'd fallen in battle. I mean, you know, you look at what happened with the Black Liberation Army, the BLA, the split from the Black Panthers that engaged in armed attacks in coordination with the Weather Underground. You look at what went on with the Republic of New Africa. And I mean, you know, the upsurge of Black activism in the 1960s and 70s was very much an armed conflict in which a lot of people died. And there's still a lot of people that are locked up. Still a lot of them are locked up. There's a lot of Black liberation fighters that are still locked up. Jamil Al-Amin is still locked up, formerly known as H. Rap Brown, a prominent Black Panther. You know, Mumia Abu Jamal is still locked up. I think all the MOVE political prisoners have at this point been released, if I'm not mistaken. But Leonard Peltier, the leader of the American Indian movement, he's still locked up. You know, and it was a real honor to speak on this panel. And I realized when I looked out on that audience that was there that night, I realized, like, you know, there's rooms like this in Ireland. In Northern Ireland, you know, there are Catholic churches where they're having fundraisers for Marion Price, who's an IRA political prisoner who was being held for some time. You know, there's anniversary events for the hunger strikes and, you know, Bobby Sands and all of that. And there's rooms like that full of people, right? Full of older folks, you know, with scars and wounds from the battle that are there. You know, and I thought about that. I remember when speaking to this crowd of people, you know, there's rooms full of people like that. You know, you go to the Philippines, right? There's rooms full of people full of people that were part of the armed struggle that eventually brought down Marcos and the Marcos dictatorship. You know, you go to South Africa. There are rooms full of people that were part of the Spear of the What is it? The Spear of the Nation, right? The armed group that it was aligned with the African National Congress that was involved in bombings and assassinations and was getting killed. And I mean, you know, there is a whole history of this, and we really should honor the people who came before us. We really, really should. You know, as much as we're critical of what's there now, the synthetic left, right? The fake left, the bread tube, woke, CNN, Twitter socialism. We can criticize that, but that doesn't mean we have to denigrate the folks who were there before, right? Because the folks in the 1960s, the folks in the 1970s, yeah, it wasn't a working class movement. It was a middle class alienation. It was very much, you know, a kind of a middle class alienation, but it wasn't that for the black people. Among the black community, it was definitely not, you know, middle class alienation. I mean, it was the black working class fighting for its survival. You know, every major city in the country went up in flames in 1968 in April after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And, you know, I mean, we can honor that as part of our heritage. We can honor the 1960s movement that used to exist before leftism became trendy, before leftism became safe again. Right. You know, there was a current of people who held on to the 1960s, who never surrendered, I think. And those people are worth recognizing. They're worth recognizing. And one thing that I've always been clear about is I am for a blanket amnesty for all of the black liberation fighters that are still locked up, all of the Weather Underground and May 19th Communist Organization people that are still locked up. I'm for an amnesty because the FBI killed a lot of people during those years. And, you know, the COINTELPRO, they killed a lot of black activists. They killed a lot of people. They framed up a lot of innocent people and sent them to prison. And none of the FBI people have ever gone to prison for that, you know, and none of the politicians that were involved in covering up, you know, the atrocities in Vietnam, they haven't been locked up, you know. Geronimo Pratt was a black revolutionary activist. He was locked up for years. And, you know, and you know, his defense at his trial, he said, you know, I am a trained marksman. I'm a U.S. Army veteran, and I'm a good shot. But even I cannot hit a target that was 200 miles away. And I was 200 miles away. I was at a meeting of the Black Panthers when this murder happened. And they said, oh, yeah, can you prove it? And he said, yeah, the FBI wiretapped the whole thing. The FBI wiretapped the whole thing. And they were there. They recorded that I'm at the event. So they went to the FBI to get the files to prove that he was at this Black Panther meeting. And the FBI lost the files. You know what I mean? They just, our surveillance of that meeting, we lost it. And this guy sat in prison for decades. Geronimo Pratt, you can read about it. Geronimo Pratt, he sat in prison for years. When the FBI had evidence proving he didn't commit the murder, their own surveillance proved he didn't commit the murder, and he sat in prison for years just for being a black freedom fighter. Until finally a judge came along and he said, yeah, actually, it looks like you were innocent of this, and a judge released him. Very famous case. And so with all of these people that were framed up, with the massacre at Kent State University, May 4th, 1970, an unarmed crowd of protesters was protesting, and the National Guard just opened fire on them, killed 4 students. 2 of them were protesters. 2 of them were just students who were walking to class. They weren't even part of the protest, and they got killed, right? Jeffrey Miller and Allison Krauss, 2 young people that were participating in an anti-Vietnam War protest were shot dead, at a peaceful protest in Kent, Ohio. And I got to tell you, I grew up, this is kind of depressing, but I grew up in a small town in Ohio. It's not very far from Kent State, right? Kent State University is where this horrendous massacre happened. 1970, peaceful protest against the Vietnam War was happening, May 4th, 1970, and the National Guard opened fire on it. And when I was a kid in the early 90s, the old people were still mad about this. They were still angry about it. Like decades later, they were angry about it. And every year around the anniversary, when TV news would reflect, it's the 100th, it was not the 100th, the 10th, the 20th, the 30th anniversary of the Kent State Massacre. every year I would hear these old people explain that they deserved it. And I heard old conservatives explain to me that those 4 students deserved to die because they were disrespecting our troops. They were cursing. They were un-American and unpatriotic. They were using drugs and they deserved to die. And it's like, no, we don't have the death penalty for any of those things. I mean, they are rude. These young people were nasty. They were whatever, but they didn't deserve to die. It was the most ridiculous thing. And I would hear it from the older folks every year. I would hear it from them, about how these students had deserved to die, how everyone says it was a massacre and it shouldn't have been. It's not a massacre. They were violent protesters, Oh, there you go. All right. Right. Cindy Sheehan. Great one. And, I would hear it every year. The woman who was killed, right? So 2 of the students who were killed were not part of the protest. It was a young man and a young woman. They were just walking to class. They weren't part of it. The 2 who were killed, Jeffrey Miller and Allison Krauss. Jeffrey Miller was from New York City. He was from Brooklyn, and, he was Jewish, and there would be anti-Semitism directed toward him. And I would hear that, and Allison Krauss was a young, German-American young woman. I mean, this part of Ohio, by the way, the part of Ohio that I'm from, everyone's got a German last name, Miller and Steiner and Glunzmann and, Schumacher and Pricing, and everyone's got a German last name. So this was just a young girl from the area. She was actually from the area. Her name was Allison Krauss. And I would hear like the nastiest things about her in particular, this young woman. They would say she was a slut. She would offer to, I would hear people, stuff that was just made up. I'm sure it wasn't even true. They would say things like, well, that Allison Krauss who got shot down, everyone knows that she would go around and offer to sleep with any guy who would dodge the draft. That's not true. And that's like a nasty thing. It was like, oh, she deserved to die, or she used to flash. She used to flash the soldiers, right? When the National Guard was on the campus, she would flash her boobs at them and stuff. Like, come on, and what if she did? Did she deserve to die for that? Like, it was just so, was so nasty. I would hear people just trying to justify the Kent State massacre. It was really, really horrendous to hear people do that. But it was the fact that, why were they doing that? I mean, it was decades later. I was a kid. I didn't know about it. I was a kid. So why am I hearing every year them justify the Kent State massacre? Because part of these people deep down in their souls knew that the Kent State massacre was wrong. They wouldn't be talking that way. They wouldn't be making up stories about Allison Krauss, and they wouldn't be talking about, well, that Jeffrey Miller, he was a Jew from New York. He wasn't even from here. He came down here to stir up trouble. They wouldn't be saying that, right? If they didn't on some level know that what happened to those 4 students was wrong. They knew it was wrong. And that's why they're telling themselves over and over again, no, they deserved it. No, they just, they would tell themselves that over and over and over again. They wanted it to be okay what had happened, but it wasn't okay. I mean, these 4 students were protesting peacefully, and the Army opened fire on them and killed them. And that's a lot of times you'll hear people, when people give a really over the top response to you, right? When people like lose their minds, they're not talking to you, they're talking to themselves. They may not even realize it. They're not talking to you, they're talking to themselves. I've noticed that, that sometimes the most hostile responses that you'll get from people, are from people who really agree with you deep down. It's actually fascinating, right? If somebody doesn't agree with you, someone just doesn't agree with you, right? You go to talk to somebody about communism, you go to talk to somebody about some political issue, and they just don't agree with you. They just don't agree with you, right? But if you get a really fired up response from some people, it's because there's part of them that does agree with you. And they're shouting at that voice within their own head that is scared of what you have to say. It's a very important thing to remember. And like, that's those adults who were trying to tell me as a kid that the Kent State massacre was somehow justified. They somehow deserved it. They were not telling me that. They were telling themselves that. And that's an important thing, right? And you'll see that in a lot of different people. But really, when it gets down to it, The 1960s political movement, the 1960s left, was largely comparable to ancient Roman Stoicism. Okay? This is actually really important, right? So, in ancient Rome, very good book I recommend you read. If you really want to learn about a Marxist understanding of ancient Rome, a Marxist understanding of Christianity, I recommend you read. Do I have it here? I don't think I guess I don't have it here. It's on another bookshelf. Oh, no, here it is. Yeah, here it is. I recommend you read The Foundations of Christianity by Karl Kautsky. Karl Kautsky, yeah, he was, not, he didn't ultimately end up supporting the Bolshevik Revolution. He was the leader of the German Social Democratic Party. But, he did this extensive study of Christianity from a Marxist perspective. And he wrote this book that was published in like 1900, I believe. He wrote this book on Christianity, on the history of Christianity. And it's called The Foundations of Christianity. It's written by Karl Kautsky. And it's very, very good. And one of the most fascinating things about it is its analysis of ancient Rome, right? In this book, you get an analysis from a Marxist perspective of the Roman Empire, of why the Roman Empire fell, of what role Christianity played within the Roman Empire. It's really fascinating stuff. And one of the things that Karl Kautsky points out is that in Roman society, there were two prevailing trends: hedonism and stoicism, right? When Rome got going, hedonism was the primary trend. And hedonism was this belief that pleasure was the highest good. Live for pleasure, right? And that's how you hear about, in Rome, they worshiped the god Dionysus, right? Or Bacchus, right? And this was the god of wine, the god of orgies and partying, the cult of Dionysus, the cult of pleasure, right? It was a big thing among the Roman elite. They would have parties and they would celebrate and enjoy themselves. And one of the most famous things that they would do, it was really common for Romans to do, is that they would stuff themselves full of food at these parties, eat so much food that they would be full, and then they would vomit and eat more food, right? Now, some people say, well, they had a room called a vomitory. That's not actually correct. That's a mistranslation. But apparently, some of these Roman emperors, they had a servant whose job is he carried a big feather around. And so at this party, when the emperor would be stuffing his face full of food, he would get to be so full, and then he would motion over to the servant. The servant would shove this long feather down his throat and tickle his throat until he vomited it all up, and then he would go eat more food. I mean, it's sickening, right? And especially, this is at a time in human history, mind you, when like most of humanity is malnourished, right? And we know about the Roman Colosseum, right? About the Colosseum, where they would watch people be devoured by lions and watch gladiators, fight to the death. And that there was this twisted hedonism in Rome, right? And that the reason that they did the gladiatorial shows, the reason that they would crowd the auditorium with people to watch people be, sliced up and eaten by lions or drowned, and the reason they would do that was it was, in a way, they were trying to get people toughened up, get people to support wars, not get people to not be soft, right? The Roman Empire was an awful place, and the primary teaching among Romans was this belief that one should live for pleasure, and war and militarism was a huge part of life. The Roman Empire basically went around the world, and it had a huge army, and it went around the world, went to various kingdoms and nations, and would force them to deliver tribute, right? It was they would go to an area, they would force the king to give them so many slaves every year, so much goods every year. Rome was like a giant moocher. Basically, it was a city-state at the center of this global empire, and it went around the world mooching off of everybody else, right? It would go to various kingdoms, force them to give them their crops, force them to give them, so many slaves, and they extracted slaves from the rest of the world, and they extracted crops and food and metal goods from the rest of the world. The Roman Empire was basically a big parasite. It was a big military parasite on the world. It went around the world, robbing the world. And at the center of the empire was this mighty city called Rome, right? Which is where all this wealth that was being extracted from all over the world by this empire was. And in the city of Rome, you had your Roman citizens, your patricians and your plebeians, right? And the Romans would engage in all these elaborate ceremonies and gladiatorial shows, all these things that were intended to bring pleasure. And hedonism was the primary trend among Romans, for the beginning of the Roman Empire, especially for the Roman Republic before the assassination of Julius Caesar, when the Republic was toppled, before it became an empire, when the Republic still existed. I mean, it was always an empire, but when they still had an elected government, right, or a hereditary senate and stuff like that, before they had an emperor, hedonism was the primary way of viewing things. But as Rome continued and as Rome developed, and as the Roman Empire continued to exist, you got a second trend that emerged among Romans. And it was called Stoicism. And it's different than what we think of as Stoicism now. Stoicism now, if you say someone's a real Stoic, it has kind of a different meaning. But Stoicism set in after a few hundred years of being a brutal empire that ruled the world at the point of a spear, that was, mooching and parasiting off the world, gladiatorial shows, hedonism, the cult of Dionysus. You got this tendency, this trend called Stoicism. The philosopher Seneca is considered one of the main voices of Roman Stoicism. And Stoicism was a response, and it was Romans that were probably more intelligent than your average Roman. Romans who were smart enough to go, maybe the gladiatorial shows are not good. Maybe watching people being devoured by lions in a coliseum isn't a good thing. Maybe there's more to life than stuffing your face full of food and vomiting and then stuffing your face again. And you got this development of the Stoicist movement in Rome. That was a group of people who said, they want something higher in life. And they said, be kind to other people. They would torture themselves. They would starve themselves, right? Instead of stuffing your face like a hedonist, they would go days without food in order to strengthen themselves and have a spiritual experience. And the Stoicists would use hallucinogens, hallucinogenic drugs. And they would engage in different rituals that induced pain or whatever. It was designed to bring them spiritual enlightenment. And they put out a message of, be nice. Why can't we all be kind and nice? And Stoicism, to some degree or other, it was somewhat hypocritical, because how do you be nice in a society based on slavery? It's really hard to be nice in a society based on slavery. It's really hard to be nice at the center of an empire that goes around the world, extracting slaves and extracting food and extracting, metal goods at the point of a spear. I mean, the whole Roman Empire is a big, brutal slave empire. But at the center of it, you start to have a group of rich people who are like, oh, let's all be nice. I'm going to starve myself. I'm going to take hallucinogens so I can have a spiritual experience, and that Stoicism, this nice Roman, right? It was like weariness with war. It was weariness with war, weariness with hedonism, weariness with cruelty. It was, Romans that were looking for something deeper, right? And was it better than hedonism? Was Stoicism better than hedonism? I mean, was it? I mean, maybe. I mean, they're saying be nice to people. And that's a step up, but they weren't doing it. I mean, how do you be nice to, they weren't giving up their slaves. They weren't ending slavery. They weren't, they were still engaging in all these wars all over the world. But they're saying be nice while they do it. They're telling people to not hold grudges and to forgive each other. Julius Caesar was famous for forgiving his enemies too, by the way. Did you know that? Julius Caesar, that was one of the things he was famous for. He forgave his enemies. It was a strength. The Romans were blown away that Julius Caesar, somebody could be his mortal enemy and he would then defeat them in a war and forgive them. And that made him amazingly strong because he was able to turn friends into allies by forgiving them. But there you go. Okay. On Venice oligarchy. But Stoicism as a trend, at the end of the day, it wasn't going to bring down the Roman Empire. It wasn't making the Roman Empire a better place. It softened the Roman Empire a little bit. I mean, and as the Roman Empire progressed, it gradually started out that hedonism was the prevailing trend, the cruel hedonist who enjoys pleasure and is indifferent to the suffering of others. And then gradually, as the Roman Empire got going and as the population got more weary of it, Stoicism began to take place, right? Stoicism began to take place. Stoicism became the prevailing trend. Okay. Good question. Writing it down. All righty. Good question. Thank you, Lumpia. And I guess there was another super chat that I missed, I think, right? Oh, I didn't miss it. But anyway, so Stoicism became prevailing. And ultimately, Christianity, Roman Christianity, the Roman Christianity, when Constantine converted to Christianity, and then you had Julian the Apostate came after him and was not a Christian, and then eventually Christianity becomes the religion of the Roman Empire. In a lot of ways, the Christianity that the Roman Empire ultimately adopted as its official religion was an expression of Stoicism. One example in Rome was infanticide. It was routine in ancient Rome to kill babies. When babies were born, they had this whole elaborate ceremony, right? That makes it okay, by the way. Did you know that? If you put a ceremony around something, it's totally okay, no matter what it is. The death penalty, right? If you put an elaborate ceremony around killing someone, it's not brutal anymore because I'm joking, of course. This is how the human mind works, right? We invent elaborate rituals and ceremonies to make things that are very gross and ugly and unpleasant somehow okay. Right? This is a really common thing we do as human beings. And in Rome, right, when a baby was born, a slave baby or the baby of one of the wives of a Roman leader or whatever, they had this ceremony where, the baby would be presented before the master of the house, the Roman citizen who owned the household. And the baby would be taken from its mother and it would be presented to the master of the house. And he would be sitting upon his throne and he would look down at the baby and he would inspect the baby. And if you said yes, then the baby got, brought into the household and he accepted it. And if no, then they took the baby and they threw it in the river or they threw it in the middle of the woods. And that was routine. It was infanticide. Killing babies, literally killing newborn babies was a routine thing they did in Rome. It was routine. It was expected. And they actually had the death penalty in Rome if you had a baby that was deformed and you did not kill it. If you were the master of your household and a baby was born and it was deformed and you didn't throw it in the river, then you would be executed, right? It was eugenics. They were basically trying to, clean up the gene pool. It was really, really disgusting. Well, one of the things that happened is as Stoicism prevailed in Rome, they did the opposite and they outlawed infanticide. Okay, that's a good thing, right? You're not killing newborn babies anymore. But, it's a pretty, that's the kind of society it was. And after a while, they're like, okay, let's not kill newborn babies anymore. Okay, let's build some orphanages so that we don't have homeless children all over our streets. Okay, we'll feed the poor people. It was like Rome was gradually becoming less mean, right? As its empire got older and as the population grew more weary. And that's what Roman Stoicism was. That's really what Roman Stoicism was. And the point that I'm making is that in a lot of ways, the 1960s New Left what you can call the movement of those people that saw the UFO in downtown Cleveland, those Hare Krishnas with their, their lights on their head, and the, they had the strap with, like a light bulb, and those veterans for peace that convinced the young homeless guy not to join the military. That's what the 1960s New Left largely was. It was an expression of stoicism. And it was more privileged younger folks in the heart of the empire saying, you know what? Why can't we all be nice? I don't like the brutal militarism of U.S. society. I want to do my own thing, man. I want to chill out and smoke some weed, right? It's the stream. This is stream number 420, by the way, just throwing that out there. I want to do hallucinogens. I'm going to starve myself for a day so that I can think about what the people in parts of the world where they don't have enough food have. And that in a lot of ways, especially among the white middle class, the movement was a stoicist development. It was people in a society based on war in the middle of an empire longing to make life nicer. Right? Why can't we all just get along? Why can't we just give people health care? Why can't we just have no more wars? Why can't we be nicer to black people? And that the white middle class movement, does not apply to the black people that were fighting for their freedom. I mean, that's a very different situation, right? The black liberation struggle. But the movement, the white Quakers and the white socialists and the white Noam Chomsky fans and the white peaceniks and the veterans for peace, that was stoicism, right? All good questions. That was stoicism. And that stoicism sets in an empire that is in decline. And, it has its place. But at the end of the day, the reason we say out of the movement to the masses is because we're doing something fundamentally different. We're doing something fundamentally different. We are not stoicists and we are not hedonists. We are Caesarians. We are city builders. The Roman Empire had its chance on March 15th, 44 BC, and it failed because a man came along who could have turned things around. Julius Caesar had a plan to save Rome from imploding. And it didn't implode for hundreds and hundreds of years after his death, but he was the only person who could have turned things around. He wanted to make all the different city-states voters and give them representation in the Roman Senate and in the Roman government. He wanted to grant Roman citizenship to the people of Alexandria, to the people of Athens, to the people of various city-states throughout the empire. He wanted to redistribute the land. He wanted Rome to start to empower the proletariat. He built libraries. He built hospitals. He did a lot. And he had this understanding that the way the Roman Empire was going to lead to falling apart. And he was a populist. And he mobilized the proletariat, the Romans who didn't own any property, but also didn't own any slaves, but were not owned by anybody else either. Those with nothing to lose but their chains and a world to win. And Julius Caesar mobilized the proletariat. He built a mass populist movement. He had a vision, a city-building vision of building powerful trading hub cities throughout the empire and not having the world be centered around one city anymore, but extending the development throughout the known world and empowering the people in the various countries and not having the world be centered around one city, but rather having the world be multipolar. And of educating people and of building infrastructure and of empowering people in various city-states. Julius Caesar, he had this like 44 BC vision of the Belt and Road Initiative, the One Belt, One Road Initiative. And he saw that Rome was heading toward an eventual collapse. He saw that the way they were operating wasn't sustainable. And with the power of the proletariat behind him, with mobs of poor people and working people behind him, Julius Caesar could have saved the Roman Empire and could have made it completely different. However, what happened was the wealthy Roman senators stabbed him in the back, literally. It was the richest people in Rome who stabbed him. It was the poor people who loved Julius Caesar because he gave them jobs and he, redistributed the wealth of the rich, and he was planning to redistribute the land and give them property. And it was the poor people and the working people who loved Julius Caesar. And it was the wealthy, the senators, the hereditary, the noblemen from birth who hated him and stabbed him to death. And the Ides of March was the turning point. March 15th, 44 BC was the turning point. And that was the end of the Roman Republic. From then on, they had the Civil War after that, and then they had Octavian, who became Caesar Augustus, the emperor of Rome. And then from then on, it wasn't an elected government anymore. They didn't have a republic. And it took hundreds of years. But Rome was unsalvageable. The fall of the Republic, the assassination of Julius Caesar, because he was a populist, because he had a vision for changing the nature of the empire to make it sustainable and changing Rome's relationship with the rest of the world. That was the turning point. And that's why March 15th, the Ides of March, is City Builders' Day. It is the holiday for the Center for Political Innovation, because we commemorate the death of Julius Caesar. We draw from Michael Parenti's great book. If you really want to learn about Julius Caesar, read The Assassination of Julius Caesar, The People's History of Ancient Rome. And we realize that America is approaching a moment like that. The United States is approaching our own Ides of March. There will come a time of no turning back. And as much as we're supposed to love, burn it down, tear it down, right? That's what leftists are supposed to be about, right? Burn it down, tear it down, right? We're supposed to celebrate that. Folks, I don't want to live in a society that's had a collapse. I like electricity. I like running water. I like being able to walk outside without being shot and killed and robbed. And we are rapidly deteriorating as a civilization. And we have two choices at this point. We can join with China and Russia and Iran and Venezuela and the Belt and Road Initiative and the BRICS and the new emerging alternative economy. Or we can continue on the course toward deterioration. We can continue on the course to depopulation, of balkanization, of civil war, of death in the streets. We're approaching the Ides of March. Stoicism isn't going to save us. More hedonism isn't going to save us. Only the city-building tendency will save us. Only Caesareanism will save us. We need to reinvent socialism so that we can have it seize the moment. We need a new America for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. That's what we need. And I hope that my message tonight has communicated that. And those are my opening remarks for tonight. I hope you enjoyed the little news item about the UFO. I hope you enjoyed my reminiscences about the movement. So why don't I call you all out as I see you? Names and locations, names and locations. We'll do our roll call. We'll see who's here. And then I will start answering Super Chat questions. How's that? And if you have any more Super Chat questions, shoot them my way. Always happy to answer your questions. Who's here? Names and locations. Names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. Names and locations. Who's with us? Who's with us tonight? I will call you out as I see you. Names and locations. We got Temple City, California. We got Dylan Smell, Bill Bradley, Cleveland Pirate Alex. We got Lawrence Johnson in Chicago. We got rural Missouri, Tyler McConnell. My grandmother was from Missouri. We got Io Hillary in New York City. Shout out to you. We got Jenny Lynn in Cincinnati. We got Clyde in Melbourne. We got David Fox in Bendigo, Australia. We got Ian Foster in Chester, England. We got Comrade Robert from Hawaii. We got Justin Rivera in Riverside, California. Pan American in San Antonio, Texas. We got Anthony in Detroit. We got Kate from Maine. We got St. David from Bermuda, or St. David's Bermuda, Restless Native. We got Class Analysis in Cali. We got I'm from Croatia, right? We got Doc in New York, Bob Troy in New York, Caitlin from Chicago. Good times, folks. We got Red Illuminati in the middle of New Jersey. We got CJ Meck of the Chicago Workers School. We got Jose Gonzalez from Caracas. We got Matt in Maryland. We got Carmen in Reading, Pennsylvania. We got Pumpkin the Cat from Pittsburgh. Wow, it sounds like a children's book. Pumpkin the Cat from Pittsburgh. Southern Oregon, Gribble Report. We got Joaquin from Brazil. We got Lionel from Melbourne. Alan in Chicago. Jamie in St. Paul, Minnesota. Joe in Cambodia. Florence, Italy. Stefano Rossi. We got Los Angeles, Ishmael. We got Clyde in Melbourne. We got Caitlin from K. We got Area 51, Based Lurker. We got Deborah in Mexico City. Shout out to you, Deborah. Good to talk to you. We got Manchester, England. Mid and out of Midwest, Olympia Logic. Micah in Las Vegas is with us. Cece from Iran is with us. Good stuff, folks. Good stuff, good stuff, good stuff. Joseph Bronze Tito is here. Very, very good. Anybody else? Names and locations. I see Carter from Duluth, Minnesota. Who else is with us? Juan from Florence, Italy. We're popular with the Italians, aren't we? We got Combate from New England, right? We got Boo. We got Jake from Sacramento. We got Cece from San Francisco. Very, very good. Eduardo, Brazilian living in California. Very, very good. Very, very good. Good stuff, folks. Good stuff. Good stuff. All right. A lot of super chats to answer. That's okay. And if you got more for me to answer, by all means, shoot a super chat my way. Always love to answer your questions on here. First question is history and criticism of Kerensky. Alexander Kerensky was the head of the provisional government. So the Russian Revolution, for those of you not familiar with the history, in February of 1917, Tsar Nicholas II stepped down. Tsar Nicholas II, he was the Tsar. He was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. He was the king of Russia, the Tsar. He was like the head of the church and the head of the state. He was the leader of the country. They were fighting World War I. World War I was quite unpopular. There were food shortages going on. There was a strike that happened. And generally, when strikes would happen, especially during the context of the war, the government would show up, the police would just show up and arrest everybody. But because the Tsar was very unpopular, he had embarrassed the country, his wife, and had an affair with the guy, what's his name, the Rasputin, the flim-flam monk who said he could do magic, and everyone was kind of laughing at the Tsar because of his involvement with this flim-flam man. And on top of that, the economy was very bad, and there were food shortages, and they were not doing too well in the war. And the majority of the Russian capitalists and the majority of the military, everybody wanted Tsar Nicholas out. So usually when there was a strike, the police would just show up and arrest everybody. So there was a strike that happened, and the police showed up to arrest everybody. And then the Cossacks, those are the cavalry, right? Those are the soldiers who ride horses, and it was hereditary. It was like you were born into it. It was like in your family. It was a lineage, right? But it was the soldiers who ride horses in Russia. They showed up and they sliced the heads off of the cops and protected the strikers. And so when that happened, when the Cossacks showed up and rode in to protect the strikers from the police, At that point, that sent a message to all of the people throughout Petrograd, St. Petersburg. You can go on strike. The military supports you going on strike. And so all over the city, workers walked off the job and went on strike. And the military was protecting the strikers, and all kinds of people were calling on the Tsar to step down. And so Nicholas II, Tsar Nicholas II, stepped down as the head of state, and he abdicated the throne. And that was in February of 1917. It would be March, according to our calendar. They went by a different calendar. So the February Revolution, 1917. The February Revolution of 1917 happened. So then after that, you had what was called the Provisional Government. And it was a new government that was formed with the idea they would eventually have a constituent assembly to write a new constitution. They'd have the people go and elect delegates, and those delegates would write a new constitution. Kerensky was the head of the Provisional Government, and he was not against the war. Kerensky continued fighting World War I, and he was not against the war. And the Provisional Government was very weak, right? Okay. Writing it down. And thanks for the super chat. And it was very weak. And the country was very divided about should we continue fighting in World War I or should we not continue fighting in World War I. Kerensky was for fighting in World War I, and throughout they had the July days, July of 1917. There were strikes all over St. Petersburg and all over Russia against war, down with war, and people were rioting in the streets and saying they didn't want to fight in the war anymore. The Bolsheviks sometimes they were being arrested, sometimes they were being released, and it was clear there was a big division about the war. So then in September of 1917, the Kornilov, the leader of the military, I forget his first name, Kornilov, decided that he was going to overthrow the provisional government of Kerensky and establish a military dictatorship. And so Kornilov, who had been a general who was fighting World War I, took his army and started marching it towards St. Petersburg. They were going to march into St. Petersburg and topple Kerensky, topple the provisional government, and establish a military dictatorship. And as they were marching towards St. Petersburg, they were going to establish this military dictatorship. The Bolsheviks started fortifying military defense of St. Petersburg. And the Bolsheviks had their own militia and their own army. And it got to the point that the Bolsheviks' army was bigger than the actual Russian regular army. And it got to the point that the provisional government of Kerensky handed over the keys and handed over, the armaments and weapons to the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks fortified Petrograd against the Kornilov reaction, against Kornilov's attempt to seize the city. So the Bolsheviks built up and they fortified the city and they built barricades and they set it up. So basically, hey, Kornilov, if you come into this city to overthrow Kerensky and establish your government, a lot of you are going to die because we got the city all fortified. And when that happened, a lot of the soldiers that were marching towards St. Petersburg under the direction of General Kornilov, they didn't want to die. So they started deserting. And they said, screw this. We're not marching into St. Petersburg to go have a big shootout with the Bolsheviks, and we're not doing it. And there were so many soldiers who defected from the Kornilov military column that was marching toward St. Petersburg that Kornilov ultimately turned around. And he sent a message to Kerensky. He said, don't worry, I'm not coming. I'm done. Kerensky called off his attempted military coup. At which point, the Bolsheviks were the biggest political force in St. Petersburg. They had the biggest army. They had the biggest forces. So the following month, October, you have the Great October Revolution, which was technically in November, according to our calendar. And in October, the Soviets, the workers' councils that were dominated by the Bolsheviks, they took power. So yeah, Kerensky was like the middleman, right? Right after the Tsar was toppled, you had Alexander Kerensky, who continued the war, and he was kind of a weak leader, basically. and he was threatened with a military coup by a military Bonapartist strongman who was going to crush all anti-war activism. The Bolsheviks protected Kerensky, and then they overthrew him. And that's an important point, right? The Bolsheviks didn't support the provisional government. The provisional government was continuing the war, sending workers to their death. The provisional government was awful. But the Bolsheviks strategically aligned with the provisional government so they could overthrow it, right? And that happens, right? The Bolsheviks took power through a series of different alliances. They aligned with the bulk of the Russian bourgeoisie that wanted to get rid of Tsar Nicholas. They aligned with the anti-war faction among the bourgeoisie that was doing business with the Germans. They aligned with the German government. The German government gave them loads of money and sent Lenin back to Russia on a sealed train with a bunch of money. The German intelligence, sent Lenin back there. And then they aligned with Kerensky against Kornilov, and they were aligning with different people, making themselves useful to different people, the whole time building up their own forces, expanding their own ranks, right? And this is how revolutions tend to happen. When society enters a very big crisis, there become big divisions in the ruling class, and the capitalists start fighting with one another. And that creates an opening for the workers. And revolutionary organizations align themselves with one faction against another, and then they align with another faction against another, and another faction against another, and ultimately end up taking power. And that's the story of the Chinese Revolution. That's the story of Fidel Castro. That's the story of Bolivarian socialism, that by positioning themselves strategically, building up alliances, that's how you move toward taking power, right? These are the methods, right? And that non-state actors, revolutionary organizations, cadre organizations, groups of people that are dedicated fighters are very useful to the bourgeoisie in their ongoing chess game against each other, right? The capitalists have their competing interests. They're battling each other for profits. And especially when you enter an economic crisis, when they're looking to have a strong government to stabilize the economy, but they all want the government to suppress the other guys and not suppress them. These kind of strong-arm Sorelian organizations become very useful to the ruling class. However, those organizations have their own interests ultimately. So this is what we can learn from the history of the revolutionary movement. I guess you asked me about Kerensky, so I'm reflecting on that. There's a super chat that I missed here. Do you think the synthetic left values today's upper classes is similar to Roman Stones? Okay. So there you go. That's what we can learn from Kerensky. I hope that was helpful. So there you go. Next question. The Brazil's Lula. Look, I was hopeful. Lula was would you describe Putin as a revolutionary? Lula was framed up to keep him from running for president in 2016, right? I was in Brazil in 2016. Dilma Rousseff, who was Lula's successor, also from the Workers' Party, she was railroaded out of office in what was later proven to be a U.S. coup, a U.S. government coup. And she was railroaded out of office. And Michel Temer, her vice president, took power. And then they had an election a couple years later, and Bolsonaro from the hard right won that election. Well, the only reason Bolsonaro won that election is because Lula da Silva was in prison. They framed up Lula da Silva, and they sent him to prison. And the reason that Lula da Silva was released from prison is it was proven that the judge and the prosecutor were conspiring with each other. The texts were later released. Someone hacked phones or something and got their texts. And it was proven that the judge and the prosecutor were texting each other about how to convict Lula da Silva. So the former president, Lula da Silva, was in prison, framed up in a sham kangaroo court trial, and they put him in prison. And it was pretty clear, according to every poll, that if Lula da Silva had been allowed to run for president against Bolsonaro, the public would have voted for Lula da Silva because he was, a very popular leader. The economy was quite good when he was running the country. But Lula da Silva wasn't able to run. So Bolsonaro ran and won, right? He's a right-wing figure, Bolsonaro. So now Bolsonaro, he was president. Lula da Silva was vindicated. The text messages were released showing that Lula da Silva had been framed up and sent to prison. And when Lula da Silva got out of prison, he made a lot of statements. He made statements supporting North Korea and such. So I was quite excited. I was hoping that Lula da Silva was moving in a more revolutionary direction because they put his ass in prison after all. I mean, how do you not get fired up and angry at the system if they throw you in prison? However, it's been made very clear Lula da Silva, in order to get back into office, he got back into office with the approval of Joe Biden. And it's unfortunate, but Lula da Silva is not moving in a revolutionary direction. His running mate was not from an anti-imperialist party. His running mate was from the center-right party. Kind of like how Joe Biden took office on a united front against Trump. Lula da Silva, he's very popular, but he took office on a platform of denouncing Venezuela and making abundantly clear, I'm not Bolsonaro. Look at me, I'm not Bolsonaro. And yeah, I mean, I could be wrong. And I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong. But look, Venezuela is revolutionary. Nicaragua is revolutionary. Evo Morales, when he was president of Bolivia, he was revolutionary. However, there is a new wave of left candidates that are winning elections. They're not revolutionary. That new guy in Colombia, not revolutionary, right? That guy in Chile, not revolutionary. I mean, these guys, the folks that are coming in are not revolutionary, right? The Peruvian guy, not revolutionary. I mean, they talk a left game. They talk about racism, they talk about inequality, but they're not friendly to China and Russia. They're not building infrastructure. They're not changing property relations. They're wokes, basically, right? And that the thing is that in South America, for a long time, the USA aligned itself with some nasty motherfuckers. There's something called the World Anti-Communist League, WACL. You ever heard of the WACL? Right? It was based on the island of Taiwan, headed by Chiang Kai-shek. And it's a collection of anti-communist folks, a lot of whom are not nice people. The Contras of Nicaragua, the paramilitaries, in Peru, the paramilitaries in Colombia. A lot of those guys, that are tied in with organized crime and tied in with drug dealing and tied in with a lot of assassinations. Not nice people. WACL. And WACL, those hard right forces, they assassinate people. You have Rios Montt in Guatemala who committed genocide against the native people. Not good folks, right? And those folks are very racist. They don't like dark-skinned folks. They think dark-skinned folks are inferior. They're very proud that they're of Spanish heritage, etc. And those folks are just losing. I mean, there's just not very many of them. Now that the indigenous population are voting in a lot of these countries, I mean, those folks are going to be out of office permanently. And that's why Chavez was able to, take office, was that he kind of built a united front against those folks. Those folks had been running Venezuela and everyone hated them. And Chavez empowered the darker skinned folks, the folks who lived up in the mountains and, the poorer people in the neighborhoods in Caracas. And he had a majority and they outvoted those folks. Right. And in Bolivia, Evo Morales, the first indigenous president. Right. And those folks were brought into the political process and Evo Morales took power and the USA has now caught on to this. And it happened in Nicaragua. It's happened elsewhere. The USA has caught on to this. So now the USA has said, okay, if we keep betting on the WACLs, if we keep betting on them, we're going to lose. So the USA has renegotiated, has revamped their South American strategy. So instead of promoting the hard anti-communist right in South and Central America, now the United States is promoting the moderate, super not revolutionary, pro-drugs, pro-environmentalism, anti-growth, anti-Russia, anti-China, pro-LGBT, tired, woke, mild left, right? And that's who they're supporting. And unfortunately, it seems like that's who Lula has aligned himself with. That could change. because there's a lot of Chinese investment in Brazil, a lot of Russian investment in Brazil. Lula could move in a good direction, but right now, I don't think Lula's, I don't think good things are going to come out of this. I mean, he's better than Bolsonaro, I guess, in some ways, but I mean, he may be less independent than Bolsonaro, honestly. I mean, as much as Bolsonaro was right wing and Zionist and all that, I mean, the USA at least didn't like him. I mean, it seems like Lula's back in with the full approval of U.S. imperialism, but who knows? That could change, right? And Lula has the potential to move in a revolutionary direction. He goes back and forth, so we'll see. And a lot of it just depends on how world events develop and how the economic base develops, how the economy develops, who's aligned with who and what happens. But right now, I'm not feeling too good about Lula, not feeling too good about Petro, not feeling too good about, this new wave of leftists coming into office in South America. I don't feel too good about them. I'll be honest. All right. Is it Russia intends to bleed the West through their war in Ukraine and prolong it? No, it's the opposite. It's the United States intends to bleed Russia with the war in Ukraine and prolong it. That's what's going on, right? Russia does not want to be in Ukraine. Russia has no desire to be in Ukraine. They held off for 8 years. They tried to not intervene in Ukraine, right? And it's the USA set the whole thing up to weaken Russia. So, there you go. You got it exactly backwards. Russia's not trying to bleed the West in Ukraine, right? It's the opposite. It's the United States is trying to bleed Russia and make a killing on oil profits by driving Russia off the oil markets, by using this war to cause problems for Russia, to isolate Russia, to drive up oil prices. Yeah, this is the United States driving up the oil prices to make money. This is the United States using this to isolate Russia and push them off the world market. This is the USA forcing Russia to spend a lot of its military and resources on Ukraine because they're under threat. This is the United States engineered this whole thing, So there you go. How would you dissuade someone from supporting Ukraine? Well, just tell them, first of all, this war started 8 years ago, that it didn't start with Russia just invading Ukraine. Tell them it's really complicated. Show them how popular the Russians are among the Russian-speaking peoples of the eastern regions, and ask them, okay, it's a lot more, just convince them that it's a lot more complicated than they think it is. And then ask them, don't you think it would be better if the USA just stayed the fuck out? Right? Because, some people are never going to really fully buy the truth about what's going on there. But if you can get them to understand that, no, it's not poor, innocent Ukraine is invaded by big, evil Russia. It's actually Ukraine has been bombing itself for 8 years, and there's the Donbass regions, and it's more complicated, and show them all the things about the conflict that they've never heard before, that you're not allowed to say on American media or you get silenced. Show them all those things. Get them to understand that it's really a lot more complicated and there's two sides to it. And then say, maybe the USA shouldn't be involved. Maybe it's not our business. Maybe we should worry about America first. Do you want American working families to have food? Or do you want guns to go to this war in Ukraine that's way more complicated than you realize? I think a lot of people would say, you know what? I want American working families to have food. I want American working families to be able to fill up their gas tanks. Yeah, you're right. This is really complicated, and, you're giving me the Russian side, which I've never heard before, but, I'm not sure I agree with you, but you're right. It is way more complicated than CNN told me. So maybe we should just stay out of this. So, that's the way I would focus on it, and just use a good old America first, right? I mean, look, our government, should they be prioritizing Ukraine or Missouri? Should they prioritize Ukraine or Pennsylvania? Right? And this country is falling apart. This country economically is in the toilet. I mean, inflation, gas prices, food prices, infrastructure is falling apart. Walk the streets of New York City. Look at the crumbling, falling down buildings. I mean, it's a mess. This country is a mess, politically, economically. We're coming apart. Fix that first, then trying to fix Ukraine. So there you go. Next question. General Milley is saying the U.S. should negotiate in Ukraine. You know why he's saying that? Because the elections are over. The midterms are over. That's why he's saying that. It's that simple. The midterms are over. If you'd said that before the midterms, oh my God, they would have lost their minds. But the other thing, though, I will say this, is that folks, we as leftists are really, we're accustomed to condemning the military-industrial complex, right? And the military-industrial complex is real. War profiteering corporations are real. However, this war in Ukraine is not being fought for the military-industrial complex. Yes, they're making money off of it, but it's not being fought for them. It's being fought for the big oil companies. It's being fought for the oil monopolists that want to push Russia off the market. It's being fought for the big, huge banks that want to remain dominant in the world and don't like the BRICS and don't like the Belt and Road and don't like the Eurasian Economic Union. The military-industrial complex is benefiting from this war, but they're not the ones that made it happen. And also, there's a lot of people in the Pentagon who realize that Russia and China have a huge military, who realize that there are like dangerous terrorist groups coming out of Syria and coming out of Iraq that are getting stronger. And I'm telling you, there is a big section of the U.S. military brass. There is a chunk of people in the Pentagon that aren't excited about World War III. And we need to be paying very close attention to that. And one thing that's important to keep in mind is the military-industrial complex. Where does their money come from? The government. It comes from the government. It's taxpayer money. They are a state-controlled, a state-linked section of the economy. And they are industrial. They make shit. They make tanks and bombs and drones and weapons, but they make shit. And it looks like that old rivalry, that Yankee and cowboy war between the big oil monopolies and the CIA versus the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex. In a weird way, the military-industrial complex might get pushed into a more pro-Russian and pro-Chinese direction because they want to build shit. They don't believe in degrowth. They want to make money, and they're state-oriented. And they have an interest in stabilizing the domestic United States. And, that military-industrial complex, even though it played a very negative role, it was the worst, section of U.S. politics during the Vietnam years. It may be that military-industrial complex gets nudged more and more into a pro-Russian, pro-Chinese position against the, suicidal degrowth oil monopoly faction. Right? Are you saying Russia's state isn't benefiting monopolies by capturing? We'll write it down. Oh boy. All righty. Oh boy. All right. Next question. Cindy Sheehan occupying W's Ranch. Well, I remember that. Camp Casey. Cindy Sheehan, was the peace mom. She was a woman from California, and her son, Casey Sheehan, died in Iraq. He was killed in the Iraq War. And Cindy Sheehan protested outside of George W. Bush's ranch. And it got quite a bit of publicity at the time. It was a real big turning point in the anti-Iraq war movement. Cindy Sheehan became the peace mom, and she was very dedicated to ending the war. And, Cindy Sheehan, she's still active. She's still doing stuff. And one thing I admire about Cindy Sheehan is that she talked about how the Democrats betrayed her. All the Democrats were using her to make publicity against George W. Bush and stuff. And then when the Democrats got in, they didn't end the war. And she called out the anti-war movement for being too attached to the Democratic Party. She's written a lot of books since her time. So, I mean, she's great. Go follow Cindy Sheehan. Listen to her podcast and stuff. She's excellent. I like Cindy Sheehan a lot. She's an anti-imperialist through and through. But yeah, Camp Casey. She protested outside of Bush's ranch to protest the war in Iraq. A mother who lost her son in Iraq. Yeah, I mean, a great woman. I will say one of the most epic moments in American television. I'm going to see if I can find it. And we'll watch it here. Why the heck not, right? Was the debate that Bill O'Reilly and Phil Donahue had about Cindy Sheehan. This was an epic moment in television. I mean, Phil Donahue's kind of a liberal. We'll play it here since this is a super chat. What the heck? I watched this after it happened over and over and over again. It was just an epic moment in American television. Everyone should watch this debate. I'm downloading it now. I'm going to upload and inload the clip. This was a great moment. I mean, very rarely, do you see on television anyone like sticking up for the truth? But this was a really, really great moment, a really excellent moment in American TV history when Phil Donahue was just this regular old boomer TV host, and he was on MSNBC, and he was against the war in Iraq. So they fired him and they took his show away. Did you know this? He was fired from TV. They took him off the air because he opposed the war in Iraq. There's no censorship here or anything, Caleb. Don't be paranoid. Mainstream media is just expressing the truth. They fired him from MSNBC because he opposed the war in Iraq. And, he's still around, Phil Donahue, and he was on TV for years. I mean, for years, decades and decades, he had this talk show. So they brought him on.
Thanks for staying with us, and Bill.
Fox News on the Bill O'Reilly Factor to talk about Cindy Sheehan and the war in Iraq. And it was epic.
O'Reilly in the Factor Follow-Up segment tonight. While most politicians have stayed far away from Cindy Sheehan because of her somewhat radical views, a few showbiz people have embraced her. In the past, Ms. Sheehan has criticized Israel, saying it is occupying Palestine.
It is.
And has called Iraqi insurgents freedom fighters.
They're fighting for their country. The USA invaded.
Has accused Americans of killing people ever since we stepped on this continent.
That's true. Yes, we have killed people ever since we stepped on this continent.
Has threatened Hillary Clinton with the loss of her job unless she calls for a pullout of U.S. troops from Iraq.
That would be great. Removing Hillary Clinton from politics in the United States, that'd be awesome.
And has called the U.S. action against Afghanistan a failure. Quite a risk.
Yeah, it was. Oh, that didn't age well. Now, did it, Bill? That didn't age well at all. The U.S. action in Afghanistan, a failure. Oh, boy.
And with us now is Phil Donahue, who supports Ms. Sheehan's dissent. So I'm assuming you don't support all her positions that I just chronicled.
Let's understand what's happening here. Once again, we have a woman who got to be just a little too famous for the people who support this war. A minority of the American population, by the way. And so the effort to marginalize this woman is underway, and you're helping out.
I'm the leader of the pack. I'm the leader of the pack.
First of all, Cindy Sheehan is one tough mother. And nothing you say or anyone else are going to slow her down.
No, that's fine. She has a right to do that.
You can't hurt her. She's already taken the biggest punch in the nose that a woman can take. She's lost a son.
Oh, okay.
She's lost a child.
But look, I'm not putting words in her mouth.
By the way, she is going to be at the center of one of the largest rallies since the Vietnam War. Proud, patriotic Americans who will show up in Washington this week for one of the most massive, largest demonstrations, protest demonstrations,
and we'll cover
right outside the president's window.
And we'll cover it.
Fox is in the business of saying that this woman is somehow saying un-American things, hyperbole.
No.
Listen to what she's saying.
Nobody said she said anything un-American. We say that her positions are radical, and they are radical.
Let me tell you what's radical. What's radical is to send more Americans to die in this war, which is a monumental blunder by a president who swaggered us into it with, by the way, the at least tacit approval of the Democratic Party. There's a lot of sin to go around here.
What's radical for
you want to send more people to this war?
Listen,
is that your position?
If we cut and run out of there like you want to do, we would be putting every American in 1,000 times more jeopardy than they're in now.
We're going to cut and run anyway,
Well,
Bill.
that's your opinion.
What's my opinion? American military leaders have said we're going to draw down beginning next year.
The difference between drawing down and cutting and running.
Well,
you're a cut and run guy, and I don't want my family in danger.
You want to stay the course, don't you?
Look. Here's what I want to do. I want to give the Iraqis a chance to train their army so they can defeat these people who are trying to turn it into a terrorist state.
Bill.
That's what I want to do.
Bill.
Go.
Iraq was not a terrorist state.
Oh, no.
I hope I don't patronize you for saying
guy.
Again.
He was just a great guy.
Saddam was a bastard, but he was our bastard.
He wasn't anybody.
Donald Rumsfeld shook his hand in the 80s.
Well, that's great.
You saw the pictures. Now, listen. You wouldn't send your children to this war, Bill.
My nephew just enlisted in the Army. You don't know what the hell you're talking about.
Very good. Congratulations, Steve.
Yeah, and he's a patriot, so don't denigrate his service or I'll boot you right off the set.
I'm not I'm not.
That boy made a decision to serve his country. Do not denigrate him, or you're out of here.
I'm not Jeremy Glick, Billy.
That's
You
right. You're a
can't
little bit more
intimidate me.
intelligent than
I'm
he
not
is.
somebody you can come and just spew all
Don't tell me I
your
wouldn't send my kids.
Loud doesn't mean
my
right.
nephew just enlisted. You don't know what you're talking about.
Your nephew is not your kid. You
He's
are
my
like
blood.
You are part of a loud group of people who want to prove they're tough and send other people's kids to war to make the case.
You have no clue about how to fight a war on terror or how to defend your country. You are clueless. So is Sheehan. And for Sheehan to say that the insurgents have a right to kill Americans and you're shaking her hand, you ought to just walk away.
How many more young men and women are you going to send to have their arms and legs blown off
this is a
so that you
war
can be
on
tough
terror.
And point at people in a kind of cowardly way? Take people like Jeremy Glick, who comes on in memory of his parents, and you go
Jeremy
off on him
Glick,
like a big bully.
Hey.
Billy, you have to
Mr.
feel
Donnie,
sorry
with all
about
due
that.
respect,
Have you apologized to him for that?
Baloney. Jeremy Glick
you know
came
what I'm
on this
talking
program and accused the President of the United States of orchestrating 9/11. That's what he did. Right after 9/11 happened. Do you know what the pain that brought the families who lost people at 9/11?
This war.
You buy into left-wing propaganda, and you're a mouthpiece for it. Go ahead.
This war is not fair to the American troops. This war is unconstitutional. This war turned its back on the people who framed the most fabulous document in the history of civilization. I speak of the United States Constitution.
All right. Why isn't the Democratic Party speaking that way?
I'm sorry that it isn't. I am, but let's understand something.
Are we all so misguided?
Excuse me. 21 Democrats in the Senate voted against this war, as well as Jeffords, an independent, and may the Lord shine his blessings down upon Lincoln Chafee.
I'm going to say something.
I'm almost finished,
I'm
Billy.
going to give you the last
I'm almost
word.
finished. Lincoln Chafee, the only Republican in the Senate to vote against this war. We should be building statues to all these people. October 2002, they stood up to a president, and they knew that, first of all, only Congress can declare war. Why is that unimportant to you, Billy?
Listen,
why can't you become the patriot that your loud voice proclaims to be and stand behind the Constitution and insist that we never go to war again without the approval and consent of the United States Congress?
If they want to take action, they can take action. Now, I'm going to say something. I'm going to give the last word. The Iraq War is not something that I embrace. It absolutely could be a tactical error. All right,
it's hard to know this.
Listen to me, and then you can have the last word. Not something they embrace. Could be a tactical error, optional war, and we have not waged it the way I had hoped we would wage it.
But what?
But we are in a war on terror. We are in a war on terror. Our cause is
nothing to do with the war on terror.
Yes, it does. And if you don't understand geopolitics, if you don't understand Iraq would be a terrorist state if we pulled out of there, and you don't know anything.
It was poorly planned and poorly executed, but Bill O'Reilly wants to send more kids to fight and die. We've already had almost 2,000. Just let me have the last word. In the last year, two things have doubled. The number of dead American troops in Iraq have doubled from over 1,000 to almost 2,000. You know what else doubled, Billy? The price of Halliburton stock from $33 to $66. That doesn't shame you? That doesn't make you wonder whether this is an enterprise that is worth the support of the American people? We need you at this rally on Saturday, Billy. We need you out there in front of it. To protest.
I'm not going to be
There
at
is
your rally,
no democracy without dissent. You should be proud of people who stand up and dissent.
I respect your dissent.
A lot of fine men went and died to give me that freedom.
You got it. I respect your dissent. I think you're way off in your analysis.
You want to send more people to die in Iraq? Is that
want to win the war in Iraq?
Win. What does win mean?
Means
tell me
those
what win
people
means.
have a chance at democracy. I got to go.
How long is that going to take?
I got to go.
How long is that going to take?
Those people deserve a chance at freedom. Thank you for coming in.
Epic moment in television. You said, I think it was Pella sent the super chat about Cindy Sheehan. I always think of that moment when I think about Cindy Sheehan, because that was just That was one of the most epic moments in American TV that I've ever seen. I mean, that was just Bill O'Reilly was such an obnoxious sack of shit, supporting the war. Anyone who disagreed was a traitor. And to see Phil Donahue just roll right over him, that was great. That was epic. That was epic. But anyway, next question. LaRouche's theories about Venice oligarchy. Well, I think that my understanding, I've read quite a bit of LaRouche's material. Again, I think it's very insightful. I don't agree with everything Lyndon LaRouche says. I come at things in terms of Marxism. They come at things, they draw from Friedrich List and from Henry Charles Carey and others. But what he's getting at, right? LaRouche talks about Platonists and Plato's philosophy versus the philosophy of Aristotle. And I believe he talks about the Venetian oligarchy versus some other city-state, right? Venice, right? He talks about Venice and money lending, right? And economic theories that are based on debt coming out of Venice. There's that Shakespeare play that's very anti-Semitic, The Merchant of Venice. But the point of that Shakespeare play, unfortunately, it's wrapped up in anti-Semitism. But the point, though, is that Venice as a city, which was Christian, I mean, it was largely a Christian city, there were economic theories there about, which ultimately became the economic theories of the British Empire, that you can dominate the world by controlling the trade routes of the ocean, that banks and finance capital can sit at the center of the economy, that you can kind of control the world via trade routes. And that Venice, during the time of the Renaissance, it played a role in the rise of high finance and finance capital. And you can talk about the city of London played a very similar role. And it's about, it's about the lending of money and such. And that, there is such a desire. I was actually talking about this with Peter Coffin the other day. Look, banker is not code for Jew. All right. It's not, right? The wealthiest families in the United States, the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the Carnegies, they ain't Jews, right? And that this knee-jerk reaction that anytime you talk about finance capital, anytime you talk about imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, and the big banks that rule the world, immediately these people shout, anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism. Look, at the end of the day, industrial capitalists, factory owners, right? Now, those folks are getting more and more sympathetic to China and Russia. Industrialists, right, who believe in growth, who want to create products. Yeah, they're exploiting their workers. Yeah, they're capitalists. Yeah, they don't support labor unions and stuff, but they believe in economic growth. Whereas the main danger at this point is coming from high finance. It's coming from Wall Street. It's coming from the oil monopolists. It's coming from the big bankers that are behind Silicon Valley and tech censorship and brainwashing, that believe that there's just too many people in the world. We got to drive the population down, that believe in degrowth and want to roll back human civilization, that want all-out war against any country that's a competitor with them, Russia, China, Venezuela, Iran, Cuba. Look, all the countries the USA is at war with are oil competitors. Iran is an oil competitor. Venezuela, oil competitor. Russia, oil competitor. The big banks are all big oil monopolies. The Rockefellers, that's Standard Oil. That's Chase Bank, right? JP Morgan Chase. That's the Morgans and the Rockefellers. That's a big oil bank, right? British Petroleum, BP, huge oil company. That's HSBC Bank, the Hong Kong Shanghai banking system. The main source of power in the ruling class, the main entity, the main driving force behind imperialism is not Mike Lindell, my pillow, and it's not Betsy DeVos with her Tupperware parties. The main driving force behind imperialism right now is the banks and the oil companies. Okay. And that's why BreadTube immediately goes anti-Semitism, because they want to shut this down, because they work for that oligarchy. They work for that international oligarchy. And the Rockefellers ain't Jews, and the Morgans ain't Jews, and the Vanderbilts and the DuPonts and the Mellons, they're not Jews, right? Right? Yeah, there's a history of the whole usury thing, and that was used as an anti-Semitic thing in the pogroms that happened in the 1400s, and anti-Semitism in Europe. Yeah, we're not denying any of that history. but raging against the international financial oligarchy, the big ultra monopolies that rule the world right now, right? We're talking about ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron. We're talking about Chase Bank. We're talking about Goldman Sachs. We're talking about Bank of America. We're talking about HSBC Bank and BP. We're talking about the Silicon Valley fascists, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates. You know, we're not talking about an ethnic thing, right? We're talking about an international financial system. And BreadTube is working really, really hard to get people not to have that conversation about them. They don't want people to have that conversation, and they just label it anti-Semitism anytime you bring it up. And like when LaRouche talks about Venice and Venetian economics, he's not talking about Jews, right? He's talking about debt-based economy. It doesn't matter. It doesn't, if you have a debt-based economy, biggest criticism of Parenti's work. When you have a debt-based economy, that's the recipe for disaster. That's the British financial model, the English system, right? And it was the Roman Empire where they ruled the world as a parasite, just extracting slaves and extracting wealth from countries around the world with their huge military. This is the Atlanticist pathology. When we talk about the Atlanticist pathology, a Vandal empire that's about holding back growth, controlling trade routes, using brute force. This is the Atlanticist pathology that I talk about in my book, City Builders and Vandals. There are different kinds of civilizations that have emerged throughout human history. You have continental systems based on economic growth on the mainland, industrialization, building up regions, Russia and China. The reason that in China there's a huge amount of admiration for the Qing dynasty, the reason that in Russia there's a huge amount of admiration for Ivan the Terrible, is because when the landlocked areas of Eurasia are together, they're better. And the way the imperialists have sought to divide Eurasia is by breaking apart China, breaking apart Russia, playing all those regions against each other. But though that part of the world, Russia and China, Eurasia, Central Asia, that part of the world is better when it's together. And the empires that have existed there, and yes, those were empires. The Qing dynasty was an empire. The, Ivan the Terrible and all of that, the Romanovs, that was an empire. But in terms of economic development, living standards, etc., the best times in the history of Russia and China is when they're together. And that's why there's admiration for those empires going back years. Whereas there is a model for an empire or a model for a dynasty or a civilization that you saw with the Romans that were based in Italy, that you saw with the British Empire, and you see now that with American imperialism, which is that you just control the trade routes. The world gets poorer, but you're the middleman and everything comes through you. All roads lead to Rome. You have a mighty navy, right? And this is the other model of building civilizations, right? And that this is geopolitics, right? Atlanticism versus Eurasianism. I don't like the term Eurasianism because I don't live in Eurasia, and I think we could have a continental system. So I say continentalism rather than Eurasianism, because we're not Eurasian here in America, but we could very easily, with the vast territory of America, we could have a continental civilization here, right? We could have an industrial heartland. We could have a country that's building itself up and raising people out of poverty, but instead we don't. The United States, as far as the big banks and corporations and the big monopolies is concerned, it's Southern California and New York City. And the rest is this annoying wasteland they have to deal with that they'd really like to depopulate and impoverish. Well, no, right? We should see the United States not as Southern California and New York City, but as a vast country full of people that can be utilized to do hard work, that can be trained to be engineers and scientists, that can be smart, full of natural resources, full of territory that can be used. We should see the United States, the bulk of this continent, as something that could be glorious and wealthy. But the Atlanticist pathology, the Venetian oligarchy, the imperialist monopolists, the oil banking elites, they don't see it that way. Their understanding of how to run a world economy is by having a big navy, having a big military, and making everyone trade through you by being the middleman in global trade. Actually sounds a lot like the Antichrist. Go read the Bible, go read the book of Revelations, right? The way it describes the Antichrist and the number of the beast and 666, it's describing this kind of empire, a middleman, a global middleman, right? And that's the kind of empire they had in Rome. And I'm sure that's what, was being written about in the book of Revelations. And that's the kind of empire that we have now. It is an Atlanticist system, right? Whereas in Russia and China, they have built themselves up on a different basis, right? There's a different kind of civilization. And we could easily have such a civilization in America, right? And this is geopolitics, right? If you think about just regular politics, left versus right, you're only thinking about like this century, like the last 100 years. But if you start digging into geopolitics, Eurasianism versus Atlanticism, you're digging into such deeper stuff. People in Russia and China have a much more collectivist way of viewing things. There's not as much radical individualism. There's not as much liberalism. Well, that has a lot to do with the fact that there's not as much access to the ocean and that people learn to rely on each other more. Right. And that there's a reason that socialism rose to be dominant in Russia and China, because culturally speaking, right, that way of doing things is more palpable in an area where civilization has developed without ocean access, and they're stronger together. There's deep truths here about humanity. Right? There's deep, deep truths here about this, right? And, you talk about the book of Revelations and 666 and the number of the beast and all of that. You can talk about the Roman Empire. You can talk about Venetian bankers. You can talk about, you can talk about Atlanticism. You can talk about geopolitics and the writings of various geopolitical thinkers that have emerged. But we're all kind of pointing to a basic reality, which is that Atlanticism, the Atlanticist model, the Roman Empire, Viking, Atlanticist, plundering, raiding, international banker, oil monopoly, that mode of running a civilization is doomed to fail because it is based on holding back development. It's based on stopping growth. That's what it's about. Whereas the continental version, if you want to call it Eurasian, I don't want to call it Eurasian because I'm not in Eurasian. You could do it on this continent. You could do it on South America too. That model, the land-based civilization model, is one that is about growth and one that cultivates human intelligence and one that advances things. I mean, why is it, for example, why is it that Germany is where so many great breakthroughs happened in Europe, right? I mean, if you look at what Germany was, right? Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Friedrich Schiller. I mean, Germany was a landlocked place. And that's why you had so much advanced science and stuff in Germany, because Germany was on the continent. I mean, there's a lot there. And this is deeper stuff, right? And Marxism doesn't go this deep, right? Marxism, it's good, right? But there's something deeper here. There's a deeper truth. And geopolitics can point you toward a deeper truth. And I'm sure everything I just said there, someone's going to clip this and say that I just said I'm a Nazi because I said that. I just actually responded to this by saying it's not about Jews. I responded by this by saying it's not an ethnic thing. This is about the history of civilizations and clashes. I just went through all of the big names on Wall Street that said they're not Jewish. I just said the opposite of that. But you can clip anything and say I said literally the opposite of what they're going to say when they clip this. When they clip this, they're going to say I'm an anti-Semite. And I clearly didn't say that. So whatever, Look, I was reading 1984. I was thinking about 1984. In 1984, the George Orwell anti-communist book, right? 1984. You know what the backdrop in 1984 is? There's a war between Oceania and Eurasia. I just noticed that. I thought that was fascinating to me. Why did George Orwell, when he's writing this anti-communist hit piece, the context is that INGSOC, or the government in 1984, is the government of Oceania, and they're in a permanent war with Eurasia. Think about that. I mean, that meant that George Orwell, to some degree or other, was studying geopolitics, right? Back at the time World War II was going on and such, he was studying geopolitics. And even though he wrote an anti-communist book that was the cry of the middle class for their individuality, what he was predicting in that book, and this futuristic society he's predicted in 1984, he's predicting a society that is constantly in all-out war with Eurasia. He's predicting, it's in London that the novel takes place, but London is the capital of this authoritarian, totalitarian state called Oceania. It's Atlanticist, at war with Eurasia, a permanent war with Eurasia. And that's the whole quote in 1984 that you read where he's like, the war is not fought to be won. Well, he's talking about this fictional all-out war between Oceania and Eurasia. So think about that. Think about that. George Orwell was an awful person, and the message of the book, the message of 1984 is the cry of the middle class. Is the middle class striving for its individualism, threatened by collectivism. It's the left face of liberalism, right? Ayn Rand emphasizes economic liberalism, and George Orwell is emphasizing social liberalism. But it's about anti-conformity, right? It's after World War II. You have a wave of intellectuals, Susan Sontag and Ayn Rand and George Orwell and Hannah Arendt, and a lot of them are being promoted by the CIA, but they're all middle-class intellectuals who are bemoaning the fact that World War II kind of shows that humanity is moving in a collectivist mode, and that the intellectual is going to be crushed either by the working class or by the fascism of big capital. That's what they're saying. That's what 1984 is about. And it's a lot like Anthem by Ayn Rand. It's the middle classes, the petty bourgeoisie, realizing it has no future. That boot stomping on a human face, that's what it is. The petty bourgeoisie is doomed. Big capital will crush them, and communism will crush them, and that they have no future, right? It's petty bourgeois fatalism in the face of the Second World War, right? That's what George Orwell, that's what all the post-World War II dystopian fiction is about, right? Even pre-World War II, you have Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. It's basically saying that, right? That the age of petty bourgeois individualism is coming to an end. So that's the message of it. But the fact that the context, the backdrop for 1984 is this endless war between Oceania and Eurasia, that shows you that, I believe George Orwell, he worked for British propaganda, right? Didn't he work for the Ministry of Information for the British government, right? That means that they were talking about geopolitics. He was getting educated. They were reading geopolitical writing, because the concept of two types of civilizations, the Oceanic civilization and the Eurasian civilization, that is a deep geopolitical concept that the British developed, actually. I mean, it was the British Empire that promoted it. But Eurasianism developed as that's Dugan, and that's a whole nother school of things. But that kind of thinking, right? That shows that that's kind of the orientation George Orwell was getting. And even though it's an anti-communist screed, it's about totalitarianism. It's about conformism. That's what it's about. But it's acknowledging that there was some understanding on the part of the British that they would always be at war with Eurasia, right? That the Eurasian civilization was inherently in contradiction with the Oceanic civilization. And I think that's important. I think that's an important thing to be aware of, right? That geopolitics is important. And I think America can break with Atlanticism. I really do believe that. I believe that America can break with Atlanticism. There is a heartland in this country. There's Kansas and Missouri and Idaho and Texas. We are not North Carolina. We are not New York City. We are not Los Angeles. There is a huge heartland in America, and it's rising. It's rising. And Lincoln The rise of Abraham Lincoln, that was the rise of the heartland. And the rise of Roosevelt and the Flint sit-down strike in Michigan, and the textile workers of the South rising up, and that was also the heartland rising, right? And I'm telling you, this country is going to reject the rule of the international bankers, the industrialists, and the factory owners, and the workers, and the young people. They're going to realize the future of this country is not being at war with Eurasia. It's being at war with the international bankers and Atlanticism. And soon, there's going to be a mass movement in this country demanding a government of action that fights for working families, that teams up to promote economic growth, to rebuild the country, to mobilize. Things are going to turn. Things are going to shift. But anyway, that's my thinking, right? So there you go. So the next question comes from Lumpia, and she's asking, please explain abundance as the basis for socialism. As socialism has taken place so far only in poorer countries, do rich countries need to be poor to revolt? I'm glad you asked. Nothing wrong with asking, but I'm going to clarify. Abundance is not the basis for socialism. Abundance is the basis for communism, for the higher stage. Socialism is when the banks, factories, and industries are organized to serve public good and not profits. Communism is the higher stage, is a world with so much wealth and abundance that inequality fades away, that the state fades away, and people just do what they want to do. The necessity of socialism is rooted in the breakdown of capitalism. Under capitalism, the more efficient technology becomes, the poorer people get. Overproduction, the tendency of the falling rate of profits, right? I use self-driving cars as an analogy. I talk about the coal miner's riddle. I've told it many times about the boy who's cold. He says, "Father, why is it so cold?" The father says, "Because of the fact that, that we can't afford any coal." "Why can't we afford any coal?" "Because I lost my job at the coal mine." "Why did you lose your job at the coal mine?" "Because there's too much coal," right? That the more you produce under capitalism, the more technology increases the efficiency of production, the poorer people get, right? And that is the problem of the capitalist system. Capitalism holds back growth. Now, the reason that we've only had socialism so far in impoverished countries is because the main way that the problems of capitalism were dealt with as the capitalist Western countries were rising is they began dumping their products on poorer countries. They went to Africa, they went to Asia, they went to South America, and they started destroying countries economically and forcing them to become captive markets. The British went to India, they burned down all their looms and forced them to import their textile from Britain, right? The United States went to Mexico and forced them to import all of their food from the United States, destroyed their agricultural sector. Many examples of this. Imperialism is about grabbing control of markets. And, the countries that get blown up, Iraq seized control of its own oil, was competing. So now it's blown up. Everyone who was buying their oil from Iraq is now buying it from the United States or from Saudi Arabia, right? That it's about clearing the world, keeping the world poor so that they don't have any competition. So countries that are trapped in the dominance of Western corporations, the trusts, cartels, and syndicates, the big monopolies based in Western countries, hold these countries in poverty. They have no choice but to seize control of their means of production. They have to have a revolution and seize control of their means of production and have socialism in order to develop, right? If they remain capitalist, the American capitalists will come in and put them out of business, right? And so socialism became a vehicle for countries that are dominated by Western capitalism and imperialism to break out of that and raise themselves up. And Russia and China are the two biggest examples of that. But Cuba is a good example of that. Iran is a good example of that. Venezuela is a good example of that. They break out of the dominance of the West. They seize control of their own natural resources, their own economy. And then with state central planning, they build themselves up. That's socialism. That's not communism. Communism is something beyond what we can imagine. The higher stage of communism is a world with so much wealth that inequality fades away, the state fades away, right? That's the idea. And ultimately, communism, the higher stage of communism, is only possible when the entire world has been socialist for a really long time. And that's the difference. And that it is socialism that enables the productive forces to advance to the point that we have communism. And, do the wealthy countries have to get poorer? Well, the thing is, because of capitalism, the more wealth we produce, the wealthier the United States gets, the poorer we get. It's easier to produce shit than ever before, right? If wealth made the United States wealthier, we would be very rich right now, right? We're making iPhones and iPads and we're churning out wealth more than you would believe. But people are poorer than ever before because under capitalism, your only value is your ability to sell yourself to a boss. And the more efficient the means of production become, the more technology advances, the less they need you at the assembly line. And on top of that, human labor creates all wealth. Machines do not create any wealth. The wealth that the capitalist extracts as his surplus value can only be taken from human labor. The value in every product of which the capitalist takes his profits, that value comes from human labor. And as you eliminate the role of the worker in production, the amount of value that the capitalist can extract is diminished. So the more efficient capitalism becomes, the more productive things become, the higher technology goes, the poorer we get. And that is the problem hanging over Western civilization. That's the problem hanging over us, right? This is the breakdown of capitalism. This is what Marx was writing about in Capital, right? About how the means of production were going to become so efficient and have so few workers that pretty soon there'd be thousands and thousands of people who have no place at the assembly line. Pretty soon there would be so many poor people out there. The markets would be full of products that couldn't be sold. There'd be mass unemployment, that things would get so bad that the workers would have no choice but to come and rise up. They would stand outcast and starving amid the wonders they had made. They would have no place at the means of production, right? They would have to rise up and seize control of them. And that the millions of people that have been cast out of the economic system of capitalism would form a bloc that would rise up and use the state to control the means of production and establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is Marxism. This is the Marxist economic theory. This is what Nelson Peary writes about in his great book, The Future is Up to Us. This is what Fred Goldstein wrote about in his book, Low Wage Capitalism. This is what Sam Marcy writes about in his book, High Tech, Low Pay, right? This is The Future is Up to Us by Nelson Peary. Go read it. It explains the economics that we're talking about here. This is High Tech, Low Pay by Sam Marcy. Go read it. Explains the economics that we're talking about here. Right? This is Low Wage Capitalism by Fred Goldstein. It explains the economics that we're talking about here. This is the built-in problem of capitalism. Capitalism has four major problems. One, production for social use, or production for profit, not social use. Sellability, not usability. Two, the general law of capitalist accumulation, that a capitalist enterprise has to keep expanding for expansion's sake. And that leads to a monopoly. And so the state has to create all kinds of mechanisms to prevent monopolies because that's the natural outcome of the market. Three, the problem of overproduction, which is the worker can never buy back what he produces. And the more goods that are produced, the more people become impoverished, gluts of overproduction. And four, the tendency of the falling rate of profit, which is that humans create value, not machines. And so when you eliminate humans from production and the role of the worker in production is decreased and decreased and decreased, the rate of profit that the capitalist makes for every item he sells goes down further. It decreases because he can only extract profit from the value put into it by the worker. That's the only place the capitalist can extract his profit. And so in order to continue making profits, as the rate of profit goes down, the capitalist has to churn out even more products. And so that problem of overproduction is even further exacerbated. This is the problem of capitalism. The more technology increases, the poorer people get. And it leads to a situation where the workers have to rise up and seize control of the means of production. All right. Just got the Green Book. Your intro is dope. Well, I'm really glad to hear you say that. Yeah. The Green Book, that was, many people have bought that. That book is very popular. The Green Book, we put out our own edition of it because the world needs to know how evil what happened in Libya truly was. Gaddafi was a great leader. He raised millions of people out of poverty. He made Libya the most prosperous country on the African continent. He provided healthcare and jobs. He built the world's biggest irrigation system. Gaddafi was a great, great man. He aided the people of South Africa. He aided the Irish freedom fighters. I've heard stories from Black Panthers. This is a story I heard from a Black Panther. He talked about how they were at the Black Panther Party office in Chicago. Knock on the door. They opened the door. There was a guy in a suit from the Libyan mission. He said, yeah, I'm from the Libyan, the Libyan consulate here in Chicago. I'm supposed to give you this. And he handed them a suitcase. Bye. He walked away. They opened the suitcase. Do you know what was in that suitcase? $100 bills. It was a suitcase full of money. Gaddafi was dumping money on the Black Panthers and the Black Liberation Movement. That is a true story I heard from a Black Panther, right? And he was dumping money on the IRA. He was dumping money on the African National Congress. He was dumping money on the Palestinians and their heroic resistance against Israel. He was lifting his own people out of poverty, guaranteed education, guaranteed jobs. In Libya, every family, can you imagine this? Every family in Libya, when you got married in Libya, the government wrote you a check for $20,000 as your marriage benefit. Can you imagine this, right? An impoverished country, a desert country full of Bedouin, seized control of its own oil resources, established an Islamic socialist government with revolutionary committees like Soviets in every neighborhood. And they used the wealth for the people, and they built an irrigation system, greened the desert, started growing their own food. Gaddafi was an amazing leader. Now, was he brutal to the people who tried to overthrow him? Yep. And his security services, there were certainly violations of human rights on the college campuses and such. There were, that's not good, right? There's room for criticism. There was corruption. You can argue sometimes the way the money was handed out was nepotistic. That's not good. But largely you talk about doing good. Gaddafi was a great man. He raised millions of people out of poverty. He built up Libya into a prosperous country. He built the world's largest irrigation system. He provided health care and jobs and education. He wiped out illiteracy. He lifted that country up. And at the same time he lifted that country up, he supported people all over the world fighting for freedom, including Black people in America. The Black Panthers, the IRA, the African National Congress, all over the world, South America, all over the world, he was aiding people and fighting for their freedom. Gaddafi was a very, very good man. The record in his favor is overwhelming. Okay, if you rate, how can someone not be good if they raise that many people out of poverty? If they build up a country that effectively? If they stand and give so much aid to revolutionary movements around the world at the same time, how can anybody not think Gaddafi was a good man? And what Obama and Hillary Clinton did to Gaddafi is so monstrous and criminal. So monstrous and criminal. They took a good man, and you look at I'm not even going to get into the details. They probably don't fit YouTube's terms of service. The details about how that man was brutally murdered. And then Hillary Clinton giggles about it. We came, he saw, he died. And that's who ContraPoints is hanging around with. Right, mind you. ContraPoints is hanging out with the woman who arranged the brutal, disgusting murder of a person who did so much good. So much good. That story must be told. People need to know the truth about how satanic the international bankers are, how satanic Barack Obama is, how satanic Hillary Clinton is. And look at Libya. It used to be the most prosperous country in Africa. And their human rights and their regime change, the latest liberal cause, what did it lead to? They have slave markets there. Half the country doesn't have electricity. People are drowning in the Mediterranean trying to get out. Libya, the situation in Libya, Libya's history from the time Gaddafi took power to today is one of the strongest arguments in favor of socialism and against capitalism I've ever seen. It's one of the strongest arguments against the synthetic left that supported the revolution. It's one of the strongest arguments against U.S. regime change wars. It's one of the strongest arguments in favor of real socialism. And Gaddafi was a continentalist. It wasn't on Eurasia, it was on Africa. What did he do? He didn't want Libya to just be an oil colony for the imperialists. So he used the oil money. They exported oil and they have ports there. But he used that oil money to build infrastructure, to green the deserts. It's what I was talking about before with oceanic and Atlanticist civilization versus Eurasian civilization. Even though Gaddafi was in a country that was basically kept poor as part of the British Atlanticist Empire. It was an oil extracting port in North Africa for the British Empire with a king imported by the British. He started moving it in a direction of building it up. That's why he built the great man-made river. That's why he declared himself to be an African president. Did you know that? He declared himself, he said, I'm an African leader. He said, I don't think of myself as an Arab. I don't think of myself as Middle Eastern. I'm African. You read the Green Book. Read the Green Book, and we'll post it. Read the Green Book. There's a section in the Green Book called Black People Will Prevail in This World, where he predicts that as the world moves towards socialism, Africa will become the center of human civilization. And I think he's right. I think he's right. That, right now the West is the center of civilization. We're pivoting toward Eurasia being the center of civilization. But I think after Eurasia is the center of civilization, it's going to be Africa, right? And he makes that prediction. Black people will prevail in this world. I think he's right. Honestly. Right now, the West is in decay. Eurasia is rising. But as Eurasia rises, Africa is going to start to step up. And pretty soon, Africa, the continent of Africa, that's been through so much degradation and so much humiliation with colonialism and so much, they've been kept chronically poor, etc. I think that as socialism blossoms, as Eurasia rises, as One Belt, One Road rises, as Russia and China expand over there, as these minerals that are very important for phones and computers become so essential, as we start moving away from fossil fuels and we start moving toward a higher mode of production, nuclear fusion, I think Africa is going to become a center. And Gaddafi saw it coming. He saw it coming. And, one of the things that we constantly hear in the United States, it's one of the nastiest racist things. Those Africans have too many kids. Those Africans have too many kids. I heard this my whole life. Those Africans have too many kids. They're starving in Africa because they have too many kids. That's why they're going to lead and they're going to be the leaders of civilization, because human beings create value. Wealth is created by human labor. And Africans are reproducing. And that's a good thing. We need more people in the world. And they've been trying to exterminate the African people. They've been trying to breed them out. They're trying to push abortion and birth control. And, you read about AIDS on the African continent and all of this. But at the end of the day, the African people, that's true. They are reproducing, and human labor creates all wealth. And ultimately, yes, Africa will, there's a very good chance that as we get beyond capitalism, Africa will become the center of civilization. And Gaddafi says Black people will prevail in the world. He says because Black people have a higher birth rate. And in Africa, the population there has a higher birth rate. Africa has natural resources. He says Black people will prevail in this world. That's a section in the Green Book where Gaddafi says that. I mean, there's a lot there. Gaddafi was a great man in so many ways. Caleb, I get you on my show to talk about this. Unfortunately, I see Black people adopting neoliberal principles as a form of salvation. Well, I'd love to come on your show. I mean, we've been meaning to do this. You and me, we're going to sit down. We're going to chat. Let's make it happen as soon as possible. I'm ready to do this. Minister Farrakhan led Gaddafi from Pan-Arabism to Pan-Africanism. That's great. I mean, and Minister Farrakhan, he was the anti-war movement. All the synthetic left, all the Trotskyites, all the Maoists, they all dropped the ball. The Workers' World Party, Ramsey Clark, they were for him. PSL was for him. But for the most part, the anti-war movement dropped the ball. But Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam, they supported Gaddafi, and more power to them. Thoughts on U.S. annexation of Canada? Well, obviously, I'm not for that at this time. But, in the context of socialism or something like that, it might be different. But right now, I'm not for that. All right. All right. Next question. Communism in post-war Italy, U.S. role in its suppression. Okay, so in Italy, after the Second World War, remember, during World War II, Italy aligned with Nazi Germany. And so then in Italy, there were these things called the partisan brigades. They were armed resistance groups led by communists. And they were armed groups that fought against fascism, right? There's that song, Soy comunista, toda la vida. Bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 soy comunista, toda la vida. That's a big communist song. They sing it in Latin America. Bella ciao, goodbye, beautiful. The guy's going off to fight with the Communist partisan brigades. He's saying goodbye, beautiful, right? It's Bella ciao, right? And it's the communist armed resistance groups. They're the ones that ultimately killed Mussolini and hung him upside down from a building, right? They killed Mussolini, and it was the communist armed resistance groups that liberated big chunks of Italy. So after World War II, they formed the Italian government, and the armed communist groups had liberated a lot of Italy. So the Communist Party of Italy was very big, and it had whole regions it supported, a lot of mountainous, and it was working class regions, mountainous regions, parts of Italy, northern Italy, that are mountainous and stuff, where there's low income working class people who've been starving, and they were forming the Communist Party, and they had labor unions, and communism was a big thing. So the Italian Communist Party was a big thing coming out of World War II. So the United States was very afraid of the Italian Communist Party winning the elections. And so Operation Gladio was waged. And read about Operation Gladio, and you're going to lose your mind, because Operation Gladio was the CIA meddling in Italy's elections and doing a lot more than that to make sure the communists didn't win the elections. And they did a number of things. And that escalated in what they call the Years of Lead. And that was when there was just violent political killings and assassinations all throughout Italy. The CIA began funding various fascist organizations that would murder communists. There was a big revelation. There was something called the P2 Lodge. And this was a Masonic lodge. They were Freemasons. And Italy is a Roman Catholic country. It's illegal in Italy to form a conspiracy, a secret society to try and take control of the government. But the CIA worked with a number of Italian politicians, right-wing Italian politicians and others, and they formed something called the P2 Lodge. And it was a secret Masonic lodge. It sounds too crazy and conspiratorial to be true, but you can Google this. And it was leaked. I mean, they revealed that it existed. Oh, I can't do that tonight. It's too late. But thank you, Jilt. I really do appreciate. But there you go. The P2 Lodge was this lodge, this CIA-run Masonic lodge in Italy. Let me pull up. People don't believe me when I talk about this stuff. It sounds too crazy, but there's, it's called Propaganda Do P2 Lodge. And it was like a CIA anti-communist, lodge, Masonic lodge in Italy that was revealed. And when it was revealed, it was ultimately revealed in 1982. And it led to the fall of the Italian government, because so many prominent politicians were working with it. And it was like a secret society through which the CIA was pushing anti-communism. The P2 Lodge and the Years of Lead. So if you read about Operation Gladio, what happened was that the CIA was funding fascists to assassinate communists. The CIA also was funding ultra-leftist communists to accuse the Communist Party of being phony and engage in violent ultra-left adventurous terrorism in order to discredit communism. So the CIA was funding, on the one hand, it was funding fascists to kill communists. On the other hand, it was funding crazy Maoists and crazy Trotskyites to go blow shit up and shoot people, to accuse the Communist Party of being phony and discredit the Communist Party, but also to shoot people and assassinate people and do things that would make people hate communists and to like harass the Communist Party. The CIA went all in meddling in Italian politics. And the result was all kinds of crazy fringe Italian political groups, far left and far right wing groups, doing all kinds of crazy shit and causing all kinds of violence and instability in Italy to prevent the communists from coming to power. And that's what it was. You can read about it. And ultimately, the revelation of P2 Lodge, kind of slowed things down. But you can read about that. I just posted the link. What's important to note, and this is really important, one of the main ways that they prevented communism in Italy was by funding it. You ever heard of Antonio Gramsci? You ever heard of Gramsci? I mean, Gramsci was the leader of the Italian Communist Party. He was thrown in jail by Mussolini. In the 1960s, they took Antonio Gramsci's writings, his prison notebooks, and that became one of the main thrusts of cultural CIA Frankfurt Marxism, Frankfurt School Marxism. If you go to college now, I mean, when I was in college at my shitty little college in Ohio, we were reading Gramsci, right? Antonio Gramsci is pushed really hard in academia. Right. And it's this notion that, it's the cultural struggle, cultural hegemony. Well, the Gramsci Society is headed by the father of Pete Buttigieg. Did you know that? The father of Pete Buttigieg was the head of the International Gramsci Society. And they started funding college professors and academics that were socialists and Marxists, giving them grants and pushing them to push a cultural, anti-populist, and anti-Soviet understanding of Marxism. And this was something that went on. And the Congress for Cultural Freedom program, the Ford Foundation, they started pushing this kind of liberal, intellectual Marxism in the Italian Communist Party and in the French Communist Party, right? And in France, you had Althusser, who was this intellectual who was associated with the French Communist Party. In Italy, you had, they pushed Gramsci, and there was the Gramsci Society and all of this. And in 1978, the Italian Communist Party and the French Communist Party and the Spanish Communist Party all officially denounced the Soviet Union. And that was the beginning of Euro-communism. And that is what ultimately destroyed the Italian Communist Party. As of today, the Italian Communist Party no longer exists. It dissolved. There's something called the Democratic Left that doesn't even believe in even socialism really anymore, right? But the Italian Communist Party, they embraced Euro-communism, and it was these academics and these liberal college professor types, Herbert Marcuse, that kind of crap. That stuff got pushed. And Marxism got more and more watered down, and they denounced the Soviet Union. And now that in Italy, I mean, there are communist groups in Italy. There's a lot of communists who didn't go along with it. But the huge Italian Communist Party that was the huge force that had fought Mussolini that's been destroyed. And that is largely due to covert CIA activities. So there you go. I'm sure there's an Italian communist watching now who says, Caleb, you left out so much. I don't know a huge amount about it. That's what I know. That's what I know. That's my understanding of events. But there you go. Thoughts on the red wave not turning up? Well, let me just say this. Isn't it interesting that Biden said there was no Russian meddling in the elections? If that red wave had happened, if the Republicans had a full sweep, how much you want to bet he said he would have blamed it on Russia? Right? But now, because there wasn't the red wave that everyone was expecting, because things didn't go as solidly in the Republican camp, Biden says there was no Russian meddling, right? And that just shows you how bullshit all of this is. Next question. Caesar celebrated Gaius Marius, the JFK of Rome. I don't know enough about that to comment. Sorry, can't comment on that. The Soviet electoral system. If you want to learn about the Soviet electoral system, I recommend you read a book called Soviet Communism, A New Civilization, written by Sidney and Beatrice Webb. It's a 2-volume study of the Soviet economic and political system. These are 2 prominent British politicians in the 1930s. They wrote a study of it. And one thing I have read about is, at least in the 1930s Soviet Union, right, that the Communist Party would nominate one candidate for office, but there would be local community meetings to debate who that candidate was that would go on for hours and hours and hours. And it was the people were much more involved in the decision-making process, right? That, in your area, you'd have to elect one delegate to the National Soviet or whatever, but there would be meetings where the people would debate and discuss for many hours who got to be the candidate. And then ultimately the election, the Communist Party would put forward their candidate, people would vote yes or no. But there was like a huge amount of participation in those meetings. One thing that people assume, and this is one thing and this isn't just true for the former Soviet Union. This is true for Iran. This is true for Venezuela. This is true for Cuba, is people assume that these countries, Venezuela is a multi-party state, but so this doesn't apply to Venezuela and Nicaragua. This applies to the old 20th century socialism, right? This applies to Cuba. This applies to China. This applies to the Soviet Union. People assume that because there's one party that it was just an absolute dictatorship, that people had nothing to do with the political process. That's bullshit. The Chinese Communist Party and the Cuban Communist Party would not be in power today. Same for the Korean Workers' Party, same for the Vietnamese Communist Party, would not be in power today if there were not a huge amount of involvement in the political process by the population. In Cuba, those committees to defend the revolution, they have one on every block, and they're having meetings every week where the whole neighborhood is coming to debate stuff and to hear what the Communist Party wants them to do and to argue with each other about how to enforce it on a neighborhood level. In Iran, they have these things called Basij councils, and every neighborhood has a Basij council. And they hear what the supreme leader wants them to do, and they argue about how to enforce it. In some areas, they enforce the religious laws one way. In other areas, they enforce them differently. I've seen this. I've been to Iran. You go to northern Tehran, the women are walking around their headscarves like halfway on the back of their head. You can barely tell they're wearing one. You go to other neighborhoods, the women are completely in black when you can only see their faces, right? They don't do the eye thing. That's in Saudi Arabia, but you can only see their faces. They're wearing black. They enforce those religious rules very differently based on your neighborhood, based on what your local Basij council wants to do, right? And that, the Iranian government would not be in power for a fucking minute if it didn't have a huge group of people among the population who listen intently to the supreme leader, who carry out and enforce his goals on a local level, who are involved in the governing process, that are going to meetings with their neighbors and saying, what can we do in our neighborhood to enforce the goals of the revolution? That's way more democratic than what we have in the United States. In the United States, we get to vote, once a year, maybe once every 4 years for president. What they have in Cuba, where you're going to a meeting every week with your committee to defend the revolution, to debate issues, and to, the Communist Party, you got members of the Communist Party, knocking on your door and saying, this is what the party's pushing. How can you help us? The party wants us to do this. And people are heavily involved. People are heavily involved in the governing process. That's more democratic. That doesn't fit our definition of democracy in the West, but that is more democratic. And the Soviet Union, early on, it was like that. Now, as the Soviet Union, as things got older, there was a kind of a wave of cynicism that set in, after World War II, after the Great Terror in the 30s, after World War II in the 60s. It wasn't like that in the 80s in the Soviet Union. A lot of the population was cynical and not involved in the political process, and that's a problem. And that led to the fall of the Soviet Union. But at the height of Soviet power, during the period where Stalin was rapidly industrializing the country and all that, people that were there were very well aware of the fact that the population was heavily involved in carrying out the 5-year plans, in deciding who would be the candidates and such. And that, yes, it wasn't democratic in the U.S. sense. All right. It wasn't democratic in the sense that you had competing parties. You had only one party, the Communist Party. But the involvement of the population in governing the country was so much more than it is in the United States. Right. Worst old Bolshevik aside from Trotsky. Oh boy. Oh boy. All right. Next question. All right. Lenin's theory of imperialism is purely economic and doesn't account for ideologies of globalism, Zionism, and nationalism. Well, here's the thing. Marxism talks about base and superstructure, that the ideologies of any society are rooted in the economic base. Karl Marx said that the ruling ideology of any era is the ruling ideology of the ruling class, right? In feudalism in Europe, the prevailing ideology was the ideology of the Catholic Church that justified feudalism. And nowadays, the prevailing ideology is liberalism, which justifies capitalism and individualism, right? And in China, the prevailing ideology is Marxism that justifies the Communist Party's rule, that ideas tend to flow from the economic base, right? That ideas are a reflection of reality, right? This is Marxism. This is materialism. Ideas don't create reality. Reality creates ideas, right? That's the Marxist understanding. So yes, Lenin's theory of imperialism is economic, but it argues that these ideologies that are invented to justify imperialism, like Zionism, like nationalism, national chauvinism, I guess, like globalism, these ideologies that are developed to justify imperialism, they're a reflection of the underlying economic interest. That's Marxism. That's the Marxist understanding that ideas don't exist in the abstract. They reflect the underlying economic base. All right. Next question. Is the synthetic left today among the upper classes similar to Roman Stoicism? Yes, absolutely it is. Absolutely. In the 60s, New Left was very much that. It was a section of the population among the upper classes getting weary of war and saying, why don't we all be nice? Why can't we just chill out? And the counterculture thing and the use of hallucinogens and the tune in, turn on and drop out. Yeah, it was all Stoicism. And I would argue that wokeness and the fake Marxism that's dominating the United States now, this is the equivalent of the conversion of Constantine. Christianity started out as a revolutionary movement to overthrow the Roman Empire. It was the proletariat mobilizing to resist the Roman Empire. But eventually the Romans watered it down and made it not revolutionary, and eventually adopted it as their official state religion after persecuting the Christians, etc. Then they ultimately watered it down and turned it into its opposite. And that's what social democracy is, and that's what wokeness is. Wokeness is the U.S. empire converting to Christianity. It's the U.S. empire converting, watering down, distorting, and changing an ideology that they fought in a desperate attempt to save their empire. Read up on Marco Rizzo. He's the current ML communist leader in Italy. His party is Italia Sovra Popolare. He has recently held rallies in Rome protesting NATO. Good for him. I'll have to read about him. I'm not familiar. Sounds fascinating. Thank you for distinguishing between nationalism and national chauvinism. I think they're often conflated. Right. Nationalism is just love for one's own nation. And nationalism of oppressed people, Black people, Latino people, people in colonized nations is a good thing. We should embrace the nationalism of the oppressed, but national chauvinism among oppressors, right? Saying that your nation is the best and your way is the best, that's not a good thing. All right. Would you describe Putin as a revolutionary? Not really. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, there are things he does that are certainly revolutionary. He supports Venezuela. That's revolutionary. He supports Cuba. That's revolutionary. He supports Nicaragua. That's revolutionary. He's supporting the people of Eastern Ukraine in their right, to not be bombarded and to resist the fascism in Kiev, the forces that are tearing down World War II memorials and outlawing their language. He's standing with them and mobilizing the country to support them against the attacks from the United States. That's revolutionary. But no, Putin didn't come to power in a revolution. He came to power as kind of a Bonapartist because Russia was in such a mess in the 1990s that the remnants of the old Soviet bureaucracy, the state-run industries, the security services, they stepped up and they said, we got to save the country. The country was being devastated by free market neoliberalism. And Putin was somebody who was in with the security services. He was in with the old, state bureaucracy. He was patriotic to the country. He'd been involved in fighting against the Chechen separatist terrorists. And he was somebody to get the job done. And he doesn't, Putin has said many times that anyone who doesn't mourn the loss of the Soviet Union has no heart, but anyone who wants to restore the Soviet Union has no brain. He doesn't want to bring back the Soviet Union. He doesn't believe in Marxism anymore, though he draws heavily from it. And, he's talked about that. He's influenced by it, but he's also critical by it. The Soviet Union is a big part of Putin's political heritage, but he rejects Marxism in a lot of ways. Right? If you listen to Putin talk, he's Putin, right? And that he represents a lot of different class forces that want Russia to continue developing and getting stronger as a country and are rejecting the dominance of Western capitalism. And part of that is the heritage of the Soviet Union. Part of that is the Russian capitalism and the market sector that exists. Part of that is the state bureaucracy, the state-run industries. Part of that is the Russian Orthodox Church. Putin represents a very big coalition of broad class forces in Russia that want Russia to flourish. And the Western imperialists want to crush Russia. And Putin is in an alliance with all the communists around the world. And I've said this many, many times. right? And people get all fired up and insist this isn't true. Well, it's true. Real communists in this world support Russia. All right, North Korea, communist-led country, they support Russia. Nicaragua, communist-led country, run by the Sandinistas, they support Russia. Venezuela, communist-led country, led by Maduro, United Socialist Party, they support Russia. China, led by the Communist Party, they support Russia. Vietnam, led by the Communist Party, they support Russia. Huge Communist Party in Angola, the MPLA, they've got good relations with Russia. Huge Communist Party in South Africa, the ANC, good relations with Russia. The African National Congress and the South African Communist Party, they support Russia, right? India, there's a huge Communist Party. The Communist Party of India, Marxist, they run Kerala. They support Russia. Real communists in the world, the real communist parties in the world that have millions of members, that have seats in parliaments, that are actually running governments, they support Russia. Your stupid fucking Western leftists that all they talk about is LGBT and all they care about is yelling at their parents for being, you're racist, mom and dad, you're racist, I'm not going to listen to you. They don't support Russia, right? Your bread tube, synthetic left. I'm going to, do a 40-minute video on why this Netflix movie I like is actually showing something that's vaguely Marxist. They don't support Russia, but actual communists in the world support Russia. That is a fact, right? I mean, go to international communist gatherings. The real communist parties with deep roots among the masses, they support Russia, okay? Stupid Western liberal kids don't support Russia, and they don't represent the global communist movement. They don't. And, you can deny that all you want, and you can point to one example here or one example there. Doesn't matter. Real communists in this world support Russia. The real communist movement that turned Russia and China into superpowers, that made Cuba, a country that's the envy of the world for its healthcare system, they support Russia. Overwhelmingly, they support Russia. The communists of the world support Russia. That is a fact, okay? And it drives me up the wall that people don't know this. If you were to say this, people talk to you like you're stupid. Oh, that's idiotic. No communist could ever support Russia. They do. I've been to Russia. I have been to the Yalta Economic Forum. I have been to the World Conference of Parliamentarians. I have been to the World Festival of Youth and Students, not just the one in Sochi, Russia, but also the one in Ecuador. This is a fact, okay? The overwhelming majority of the global communist movement supports Russia, okay? And your liberal Western hipster kids and your nerdy, academic people who, read a lot of books and go to NYU or go to Left Forum, they don't represent the global communist movement. The real communist movement is a movement of working people who are fighting for their lives. Working people in Nicaragua, working people in Venezuela, working people in India, working people on the Korean Peninsula, working people in China. And they wear uniforms and they wear suits and ties and they love their countries and they love their homeland and they love their families and they hate the international bankers and they hate the global monopoly capitalist system and they love China and the Belt and Road Initiative and they love Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union and they love Bolivarian socialism in Latin America. That communist movement, that is what I'm loyal to. That's the communist movement to which I have loyalty to. Right? That's my communism. And my communism, the real communist movement in the world, they support Russia. And so I support Russia. That's a fact. You know what I mean? The real communist movement in the world supports Russia, and the fake CIA-controlled woke hipster bullshit doesn't support Russia. And you can think you're so smart and go, oh, that's retarded. No communist would ever support Russia. Russia has income inequality. Shut up, okay? You don't know what you're talking about. You don't fucking know what you're talking about. All right. And you can talk about how small. Oh, I know Marxism. No Marxist could ever support Russia. You can say that. Okay. And you can say that. You can talk out of your ass all you want about Russia being right wing and all this. I am telling you actual facts. I have seen it. I have talked to these people. In Venezuela, they support Russia. In Vietnam, they support Russia. In China, they support Russia. In Cuba, they support Russia. In North Korea, they support Russia. In the People's Republic of Donetsk, they support Russia. In the People's Republic of Lugansk, they support Russia. In Belarus, they support Russia. I mean, in Kerala, they support Russia. In South Africa, they support Russia. In Angola, they support Russia. Real communists support Russia. And I don't care how smart you think you are. It's just a fucking fact. And I'm sorry it doesn't fit the view of the world that you have, okay? It doesn't match your Western chauvinist lens through which you interpret the world, where communists are good people who talk about trans all day long, and fascists are people that attend church and love their homelands. That's not how the rest of the world sees this. That is not how the rest of the world sees this, okay? What communism means to oppressed people that are fighting for their rights, and what communism means to Western liberal hipster kids are completely different, right? And exactly, ThinkPad. So none of those are real communists, says some trot. He's a real communist. Good for him. Good for him. I'm glad he feels that way. But in reality, there is a real communist movement in this world that is attached to real socialist governments and real big communist parties, and they support Russia. And you know, call me stupid, make fun of me, talk to me like an idiot. I'm 34 years old. I've traveled to many countries in the world. I work for international television. I've been there. I've seen it. I've studied all this stuff. I know what I'm talking about. And yes, the overwhelming majority of the international communist movement supports Russia. And no, you don't know better than them because you watched Rachel Maddow. Okay? And deny it all you want. Next question. All right. Russia isn't benefiting by capturing Ukraine's vast resources for themselves. How are they capturing any resources, right? I mean, there's a middle of a war going on, right? I mean, this is the people in the eastern regions have been barricaded and blockaded and bombarded. You know, for the longest time, Russia resisted intervening, and finally, with no choice, had to intervene, right? I mean, this is like, you know, and you look at Yalta. I mean, Russia has built, I think it's the biggest bridge in all of Europe, the Yalta, the bridge that goes to Crimea. You know, they've poured huge amounts of investment into Crimea. I've been to Crimea. I've been to the Yalta Economic Forum. I've seen it with my own eyes. You know, I mean, and the amount of support that people in Russia have given to the people in Eastern Ukraine, you know, to try and help them amid this horrendous war. I mean, these people don't know what they're talking about, right? These people, I mean, you know, yeah, Russia's sitting there, Putin's sitting there on his throne, and he says, I know, I want to have more money and resources, so I'm going to invade Ukraine to get these resources. That's not what happened, okay? That's what you would think if you watch CNN, right? But I can tell you, if you look at the past 8 years, the Minsk Accords, the negotiations, Russia has done everything that they possibly can do to avoid intervening in Ukraine. They've only intervened because they feel they have no choice, because Ukraine was talking about getting nuclear weapons, because they've been bombing and shelling and killing the people of Donbass for 8 years straight, because Ukraine has been talking about joining the NATO alliance, the fanatically anti-Russian government in Ukraine that tears down World War II memorials and is honoring Nazi collaborators like Stepan Bandera, wants to get nukes and wants to join NATO. Yeah, Russia at this point, they had no choice. They had to move in. But if you think that this started, they're trying to plunder Ukraine's resources, you're delusional, right? You are utterly delusional, right? Russia's ability to export on the international markets has been greatly hindered by this war. They would prefer to be selling their fertilizer to Africa so Africans can eat. They would prefer to be exporting their grain so that people around the world can eat. They would prefer to have RT still on the air in the European Union. Don't tell me that Russia did this because it was some economic benefit. No, they trust me. Russia would prefer to not have its military in Ukraine. The United States and the Ukrainian fascists and the European Union forced this on Russia. And Russia would like this to be over as soon as possible. I mean, based on my understanding of the events, they would like this to be over as soon as they possibly can. Right? There you go. Biggest criticism of Parenti's work. You know, his book, Black Shirts and Reds, I agree with it, but its analysis of fascism is way too simplistic. Way too simplistic. Fascism is much more complicated, you know, and I was disappointed. And the more that I've studied the rise of Hitler in Germany and the economics of fascism and Holomerschaft and Bonapartism, that, you know, his analysis of where fascism came from. And he's really writing a polemic. He's basically polemicizing against people who say that fascism is socialism or fascism is left wing, which is a common neocon kind of talking point. But, you know, I felt that chapter was a little bit simplistic. I really liked the other things he said in the book, documenting how Eastern European, the restoration of capitalism devastated things. That was good. You know, investigating some of the anti-communist, propaganda we've heard about the Soviet Union. But yeah, that's a fair criticism, I would think. Worst old Bolshevik aside from Trotsky. I mean, I don't know, Bukharin, maybe. I don't know. Bukharin, who wanted, Trotsky's position was global permanent revolution. That wasn't going to work. Stalin's position was socialism in one country, meaning we build up our own state-run industries, but we negotiate with the West. We have joint economic ventures with the West. Bukharin's position was to permanently continue the new economic policy forever, basically. Continue the NEP indefinitely because Russia was too poor to have socialism. If they had done that, Russia would have remained poor, and when the Nazis ultimately invaded, they would have just rolled right over it. They needed to rapidly industrialize. They needed to build up their industries. And one thing that I think is important, and I'll just end the stream because that's the last super chat I've got. One thing that's very important is, there was a divide in the bourgeoisie. There was a division in the ruling class that ultimately led to the rise of fascism. Right? Fascism was the ideology of factory owners. They didn't like the labor movement. They didn't like the labor unions. Right? And Henry Morgan in the United States and Henry Ford, they were big fascists, but it was the financiers, the oil monopolists that weren't really threatened by the labor movement, but they didn't like that Nazi Germany wasn't paying back its loans. Germany was pushing British and American financial interests out of the European mainland. And, it was, so the oil bankers aligned with Roosevelt and the labor movement, and it was the factory owners in Germany, the factory owners, the industrialists in Germany and in Italy and in the United States, the factory owners that were fascist, right? And so that's how we remember the division in the ruling class in the lead up to the Second World War. Factory owners, bad. They're against the labor unions. They're fascists. They want a military state, military-industrial complex. Oil bankers, good, aligned with Roosevelt, allowed progressive reforms, supported fighting the Nazis. However, that division didn't come about until the late 1930s. In the early 1930s, this is very interesting. When Stalin first launched the 5-year economic plans, it was the oil bankers that wanted to keep the Soviet Union isolated. And it was the factory owners that started joint ventures with Soviet industries. This is very important. When the Soviet Union was just first industrializing, before Hitler had come to power, before the Great Depression had hit, the Great Depression had hit, but in the early 30s, right? Henry Ford had joint ventures with the Soviet Union and helped the Soviet car industry get going. Fred Koch, the Koch brothers' father, right? He went over to the Soviet Union, got their oil industry going. And Stalin wrote about how captains of industry might be more progressive than financiers because they believe in economic growth. And Stalin wrote about this because before fascism and all of that, there were a lot of factory-owning industrial capitalists that said, you know what? The Soviet Union's going to pay me to come over here and help them build their factory and have a joint venture. Fine. Right? And a lot of industrial capitalists were willing to work with the Soviet Union. However, they didn't like the labor unions in their own countries. And so they wanted to crush the labor unions. And that ultimately led them to become fascists, to crush the labor movement. But we shouldn't project that late 1930s. That wasn't the entire position of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union was industrializing, there were a lot of these captains of industry that wanted to help the Soviet Union industrialize. This is very important. And actually, and this is even more interesting, right after the Nazis took power, they greatly expanded trade with the Soviet Union. They greatly expanded trade with the Soviet Union because they were trying to rebuild the German economy. The Soviet Union was right on the border. And the Nazis, they were murdering the communists of Germany, but the Soviet Union was right on their border, and the Soviet Union needed industrialists and stuff. And so there are divisions in the ruling class, and ultimately the division that mattered when the war started, that big division when the war started, right? That big division in the ruling class between the financiers that were for Roosevelt and the British and against Hitler, and the factory owners that were for Hitler and wanted to crush the labor movement and supported that's how it ended up playing out when the war crisis started. But it wasn't like that in the early 30s. And that we shouldn't assume that it's like that permanently, right? Because right now, I'm seeing a lot more fascism coming from the Eastern establishment. The labor movement now in the United States is so weak. I mean, other than Chris Smalls and the Amazon thing and like public employees, teachers, and government bureaucrats, the labor movement in the United States is utterly pathetic. And there's, where are the factories? I mean, we still have some factories, but industry in the United States is pretty much gone. Whereas it seems like the main danger now is these financiers and the oil monopolists, etc. So we shouldn't project the Roosevelt alliance. We shouldn't project the Roosevelt alliance onto now, because it wasn't like that at the beginning. In the early 30s, Stalin was courting the industrialists, and it was the financiers and the globalists that were against the Soviet Union and wanted to isolate it. And it wasn't until the late 30s, when fascism was on the rise, that then things flipped, right? If you look at the early years of the Soviet Union, the early years of Stalin, not of the Soviet Union, in the late 20s and early 1930s, the main, Stalin was saying, look, we need to find industrialists who want to work with us. And industrialists were more friendly to the Soviet Union than the financiers were. The financiers would shame them. Oh, you're working with Stalin's brutal regime, and the industrialists would be like, the Soviet Union wants to do business with us. So what? We don't care. We don't care what their ideology is. Fred Koch, the Koch brothers' father, he didn't give a fuck. He was a libertarian. He was a free marketeer. They're communists. They want to pay him to set up the oil industry. Who cares? Henry Ford, similar attitude. He's like, oh, they're communists or whatever. They want to pay me to help them build their car industry. Who cares? Think about it. Now, later, obviously, things changed, but people forget this. So this is an important thing to keep in mind, and that industrialists in our time are going to be more pro-China and more pro-Russia. And the oil monopolists are the main danger. And this doesn't contradict anything, right? The 30s happened once, and it played out in that unique way. We're in a unique period. And the idea that a united front against the imperialists, a united front against the globalists, might include the labor unions, might include, the industrialists, and might also include Russia and China. That's not an absurd thing to believe. That's actually pretty rational. And it's not contradicting the 1930s. Things developed differently later. But there might be a lot of industrialists. There are a lot of industrialists who want to trade with Russia and China, and who want to trade with Venezuela and Iran and Cuba. Meanwhile, they're mad at the big oil monopolies that want degrowth and want to destroy the economies of the world and want to grind the world into poverty. So it's just something to keep in mind, folks. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night, folks. Good night.